Item number 19, hearing a disciplinary complaint against mixed martial artist Nick Diaz. Is Mr. Diaz here or counsel for Mr. Diaz?
Council is here, commission members, I believe we were going to ask for a break.
Yeah, can we take a 5 to 10 minute break, please?
Sure, that's fine. 5 minutes.
Nick here?
What's that?
Is he here?
Chris, is he here?
This component, the hydroxy component is back as far as on here. It was prohibited by the FDA for about 10 years, and then they allowed a modified derivative to be mass marketed.
Mr. Chair, we do have an amended pleading. I can give that directly out to you, or?
Yes. Is Mr. Eccles aware of the amended pleading?
Yes, he has it.
Do you have copies?
Yes, ma'am, it's right there.
Mr. Eccles, are you ready?
I just gave it.
Call this meeting back to order. We'll begin with item number 19. Of mixed martial artist Nick Diaz. Mr. Eccles?
Yes, Commissioners, the complaint alleges a violation of your anti-doping rules and that the respondent, Mr. Diaz, provided false information on his pre-fight medical questionnaire. The contest relates back to January 31 when Mr. Diaz fought Mr. Anderson at a UFC contest in Las Vegas. About 2 minutes ago, I was provided with an amended answer, so I believe that Mr. Granith has provided that to the commissioners. So I'd like to take a look at that. I think there are going to be several agreements or stipulations we have about which documents are going to be in evidence, and we may have some disagreements that we'll need to get to and for the commission to rule on before we can then proceed to the rest of the merits of the case.
Okay.
Okay?
Can I have, yes.
Can you wait 1 second?
Sure.
We have the system, so we lost Dr. Eichner and Dr. Sanders.
Did you just amend 9?
Just 9, just 9.
The conference is in listen-only mode. The conference is now in listen-only mode.
We're just missing Dr. Eichner and Dr. Trainer, is that it?
Dr. Sample, yeah, the online access just crashed.
Okay.
To the internet.
I think we can continue. I mean, they're critical to maybe a testimony, but at this point, when we go through procedurals, so I think we're good. Okay. So we are now just submitting, go ahead, can you please introduce yourselves for the record?
Absolutely. My name is Lucas Middlebrook with the firm of Seaham, Meltz and Peterson. To my right is my colleague Nick Granith of the same firm from our Minneapolis office. And to my left is Dr. Hanjay Joseph Kella, who's a medical doctor and a certified medical review officer. He will be our expert witness today.
All right, thank you. I understand the respondent is here as well.
He is. Mr. Diaz is sitting behind me.
Thank you. Mr. Eccles?
Commissioners, I have two experts. From Quest Diagnostics, we have Dr. Barry Sample, and from the Sports Medicine Research and Testing Laboratory, we have Dr. Daniel Iker. These are both expert toxicologists who have appeared before the commission in prior hearings. So I think we would just stipulate with counsel that they are experts and able to provide expert testimony in their capacity as expert toxicologists, unless there's an objection to that.
I mean, I think we would have to make the proffer of the expert a little more specific than just an expert. I know they're both certifying scientists at laboratories. I'm not sure of their credentials in terms of being a forensic toxicologist.
They can talk about that.
We'll ask that question when they come on the phone.
Okay.
Do you have any objection to the witness they're providing today?
I have an objection. Yes, I do. I mean, I don't object to him testifying as an MRO, a medical review officer. Once we get outside the scope of what my understanding an MRO does, he's not a toxicologist, so I do have an objection to that. And I want to make it clear that, you know, when there's scientific testimony in a case such as this, there are certain standards which make that testimony relevant. It has to assist you, and there has to be a certain methodology that is scientifically reliable. So in his capacity as an MRO, my understanding is that he would, you know, review laboratory testing results within the normal course. He would then interview the donor of the specimen if there was a positive. He would ask that donor if there was a medically valid explanation as to why there was this positive result. And in the absence of a medically valid explanation explaining the result, he would also tell the donor that they could have the B specimen tested, and that those are kind of the industry standards at play here. And that if the person did not have a medically valid result, if they didn't want the B specimen tested, then it is incumbent upon him as the MRO to then tell the employer that there is a positive test here. Okay, and that's sort of the scope. He would check chain of custody, he would do the interview, and then inform the employer, make sure the parameters of the testing are within a certain range. But that is kind of the scope of what an MRO does. And so if he's going to testify about some new kind of method that hasn't been peer reviewed, it doesn't have an error rate, it hasn't been proven to be, you know, reasonably scientifically valid, then yes, I'm going to object to all of that, and I don't think that the commission should hear that testimony.
Well, from this perspective, what you're stating at this point in time, Mr. Eccles, is that you're not stipulating to the credentials or the scope of the testimony that is going to be proffered by Dr. Kella.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so there's no stipulations between counsel or either set of experts.
That's correct.
Okay.
Can we swear in the witnesses at this point in time, please, Dr. Keller?
Would you want to do them as a group or individually?
If they're attorneys, we don't need to swear
No,
them.
I know, but do we have on the phone?
We have Dr. Eichner and Dr. Trainer
Yeah.
on the, or
So we have,
Dr. Sample.
and is Mr. Diaz going to be testifying?
He better be.
Okay, so-
I'd like to address that. So first, with respect to Mr. Diaz's testimony, respectfully pursuant to his privilege under both the United States and Nevada constitutions against self-incrimination and on advice of counsel, he will not be testifying today other than to invoke the privilege as necessary.
Well, then he'll have to do it on a question-by-question basis because it is not a blanket objection or it's not a blanket prohibition against testimony.
If you would like to draw this proceeding out and ask him each question and have him answer, invoke his privilege, we're happy to have you do that.
We're not going to, or at least my recommendation to the chair is going to be that we do not accept a blanket prohibition on his testimony, that it has to be on a question-by-question basis.
If that's your recommendation, then he will comply with that request.
I'll accept that request.
Okay, gentlemen, they're Dr. Sample, Dr. Eichner, Dr. Keller.
Correct.
Keller, and Ms. Diaz. Do you all swear to tell the truth, the entire truth before this tribunal?
I do.
Ms. Diaz? Do you swear to tell the truth before this tribunal?
Yeah.
And you realize that there's a penalty of perjury for any, if you're not truthful?
Yes.
Sure. And Dr. Eichner and Dr. Sample, you swear to tell the truth?
This is Dr. Sample, I do.
Dr. Eichner?
is Dr. Eichner, but I think I'm on listen-only mode. You probably can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Dr. Eichner.
Okay, great.
And you're all aware of the penalty of perjury mistake? Thank you.
Dr. Sample and Dr. Eichner, you understand the penalty of perjury?
Dr. Sample does. Dr. Eichner does as well, thank you.
Thank you. And we understand we just received an amended answer to the complaint. Mr. Eccles, have you had time to review this amended complaint?
I have
Or
it.
response?
Yes, I have, thank you. It appears that the amendment to the complaint relates to their answer to paragraph number 9, and that is the only change from the initial answer.
Yeah. And you have no objection to amended answer?
No, in fact, I think it helps my case.
All right, thank you. Continue, please.
What I would like to do is kind of get some agreement as to what exhibits are going in so that we can just make sure the commissioners all have those in hand and can view them as we go.
Sure.
So I would agree with counsel to admit Quest's litigation package. And it's up to the chair how you want to mark that for identification. They've already marked theirs as Diaz's exhibit. I have separate copies, and we can address it however you want. But that's one of the first things that we agreed to be in evidence.
Okay, so Mr. Eccles and Mr. Middlebrook, it's my understanding you have a stipulation then to admit the Quest litigation packet?
Correct, as long as the two exhibits that we're proffering are identical.
It's the exact same.
Okay.
Accepted?
Are there any other stipulations?
Yes. As far as evidence, the next thing we would agree to admit would be the laboratory document package from Smyrtle.
So stipulated.
Accepted.
So how is the chair marking these documents?
I'm making a list. So number 1 is Quest. Number 2 is Smyrtle.
And are you marking them states or respondents?
I'll go with states.
Okay. So as you mark these, I'm going to start handing out copies to the commissioners.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I'm handing out what has been marked as States Exhibit 1. Quest. Documentation packet from the in competition January 31 test.
I think we have lots of things.
Now I'm going to hand out what's been marked as States 2 laboratory document package from the Sports Medicine Research and Testing Lab. Thank you. We've also agreed to admit into evidence the exhibits attached to the state's complaint.
So
So
accepted.
stipulated.
Accepted.
For purposes of the record, Mr. Eccles, it would be helpful if you would identify then as, would be beginning at Exhibit 3, which of those exhibits then you're making reference to, since they have different numbers that are appended to the complaint.
Do we just go through and, like, Exhibit 1 will make Exhibit 3?
Yes.
Okay, so Exhibit 3 for the state will be the application for armed combat in the state of Nevada. Exhibit 4 will be the state of Nevada show results. Exhibit 5 will be the drug detail report from Quest Diagnostics. Exhibit 6 will be the 2015 prohibited list, WADA. Exhibit 7 will be the pre-flight medical questionnaire as completed by Mr. Diaz. That's all I have. Is that accurate? Are there any additional exhibits? Then I have the answer to the disciplinary complaint in my packet. Are there any other exhibits?
Yes, I think they're gonna have some, and I think we're gonna have.
But that's it for the complaint, as far as the complaint.
Oh, yes, for the
Okay,
complaint, yeah.
thank you.
So, just before we get to their exhibits, many of which I think I'm gonna agree to, I think we're gonna have one that is disputed. And I'm just gonna move now for this to be in evidence to resolve that evidentiary issue. Let me hand a copy to you guys. I'm going to describe I'm going to describe an exhibit that I'm going to offer into evidence, and perhaps we'll have an objection and get through it. I have an exhibit that I'd like to have in evidence. It's 4 pages. It is a LabCorp final report. It relates to a specimen given by Mr. Diaz on a date of January 23 of 2015. That's the first page. The second page is another LabCorp final report. It relates to a specimen given by Mr. Diaz on January 26 of 2015. The third page is something that's already been admitted. It is Quest's drug detail report from the date of 1/31, the Fight Night report, showing that positive result. And the final page is the forensic drug testing chain of custody and control form for that January 31 Quest specimen, which has been filled out by Ring Inspector Aldo Galvan, and that was not part of your packet, and I would like all of those into evidence.
Is there an objection?
There is an objection, but a point of clarification first is I do believe the specimen collection form was part of the Quest litigation packet. I believe you find that on page 5 of an exhibit already stipulated into evidence. With respect to the first 2 pages of this exhibit, we do object to their admission on 2 bases: relevance, especially with the amended answer to paragraph 9, admitting in part and denying in part, denying any use of prohibited substance, and further denying willful intent to provide false testimony on the questionnaire, and affirmatively allege that no answer was the result of confusion and mistake. It strains me to see the relevance of out-of-competition testing to anything besides that point, which is now admitted in part. The second objection is confidentiality, which we objected when these documents were subpoenaed and which were overruled by the Commission based in part on testimony by also an advocate, which brings into consideration ethical considerations and rules of professional conduct. You have now a witness acting as an advocate. And the second part of the confidentiality argument is these documents on their face, on the bottom, are apparent that they are protected both under federal and state confidential health laws. And in addition to that, Mr. Diaz's agent, Mr. Lloyd Pearson, was assured by UFC, that these documents would remain in the strictest of confidentiality. So we would object on both of those bases.
Okay, let me just go through those objections. Number one, your first objection again was?
Relevance.
Relevant, okay. And then the second was a confidentiality argument, and then you made a third allegation that Mr. Eccles would be acting as a witness. And then you mentioned UFC. Well, obviously UFC is not a party to this issue, and we understand that. As far as a witness concerned, I think you bring up the ethical code as far as an attorney acting as a witness, and I think that's for a court of law, not for an administrative hearing panel, if
I
I'm
believe
correct.
the rules of professional conduct apply to an attorney acting in his capacity in any hearing within a state that has licensed him to practice
But I think
law.
specifically in Nevada, I think it applies to a court and not a hearing panel or administrative hearings.
Right, it clouds the evidentiary basis upon which this document would be admitted.
Right, and you do understand this is not a court of law, this is an administrative hearing.
I am well aware.
Okay, thank you. And then
Chairman, I
yes.
hate to interrupt, but if we're gonna deal with these in turn, I have documents. I mean, you would think that if somebody was gonna make an objection about me being an advocate or violating some kind of ethical rule, they would have provided the rule.
Correct.
I do have that rule. I can hand it out.
Is that
to you.
3.7?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, can you please hand it out to the commissioners? Right, and that's why we're not, again.
Professional Rule of Conduct 3.7 is the operative rule here within the state of Nevada. There's a provision in here that indicates that a lawyer shall not act as an advocate at a trial, and so it does not extend to an administrative process. Moreover, the purpose underlying this rule is not to create jury confusion for having a advocate, like an attorney, serve in a dual role, both first by taking a witness stand and providing testimony, and then acting as an advocate on behalf of a party, and that's what the purpose is. Respectfully, I agree with the chairman that neither the letter or the spirit of this rule has been violated, and so from the standpoint of having a foundation for the advocacy, the confidentiality component of this, I think that should be overruled.
That is overruled. One clarification question. When a licensee files an application with the state of Nevada, they waive the right to confidentiality in some sorts as it relates to medical records that the commission uses and whether or not to evaluate the granting of that license.
Yes, Chairman, they do.
Okay, and so would these documents fall under that? The documents wish to be admitted by the state fall under that clause and that
Yes, they do.
exception, correct? All right. So the documents that are being objected to by the respondent are used, and I remember dealing with this case specifically, were relied upon in the granting of a license to Mr. Diaz,
Yes, they were.
based on him completing an application with the state of Nevada.
That's correct.
Good, thank you. So as far as Mr. Eccles being in conflict, I don't accept that argument and rule against the respondent. As far as the relevance of this, I think it's actually extremely relevant, and I think the fighter understands the relevance to this when they do complete an application to fight in the state of Nevada. And I think I addressed this already. UFC is not able to obligate this commission to any agreement with any third party.
It's relevant insofar as Mr. Diaz's license or something in particular to the complaint that is now alleged
Well,
against him?
the information that you're objecting to was used as a basis for discussion and consideration of Mr. Diaz's license with the state of Nevada.
And how does that relate to the complaint that's now pending against him?
Well, because in order to receive a license in the state of Nevada, Mr. Diaz was obligated to provide a clean test.
Okay, understand the ruling, our objection still stands.
Thank you. Are there any other items I further?
I think that there's also relevance in the issue associated with the information that was contained on the pre-fight medical questionnaire as well.
Thank you.
And for marking purposes, what exhibit would this now be?
This would be number 8.
Thank you.
Any additional exhibits?
No, not from the state.
Okay. respond? Do you have any exhibits?
We
to
do have
submit?
additional exhibits, whatever your choice is here, if you would rather us proffer those now, or in the context that we would be offering those through our expert witness, it's really up to you.
From this commissioner's standpoint, I'd rather have the documents now rather than later. If that's now, please.
Okay. The first we have has been marked as Diaz Exhibit 1, which is simply the CV of our expert witness.
Okay. Any objection, Mr. Eccles?
No.
Go ahead, let's go down the list.
Okay. Diaz Exhibit 2, which has been marked as such, is the World Anti-Doping Agency's Testing and Investigation Standards, which is quite a long document, roughly 104 pages. And we would offer that through our expert witness to explain the procedure and the protocol that was used to collect 2 of Mr. Diaz's specimens on the night of January 31st, 2015.
Do you accept, Mr.
I
Eccles?
object on relevance. I mean, I don't, it is the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency Testing Procedure Code. I don't think it's relevant. We haven't, this commission hasn't signed as a signatory to that, and so I don't know that it's relevant for the purposes of this hearing. And since you're not a signatory, you're not bound to follow those rules. So any testimony he would offer would not be applicable to the procedure here.
As a point of clarification, it's the World Anti-Doping Association, not the United States. And in response to the relevance argument, 2 of the specimens that was taken from Mr. Diaz on January 31st, obviously when you look at the forms and the collection methods, followed WADA protocol and were sent to a WADA lab. And these procedures and these protocols differ greatly from the 3rd specimen, which really mimicked the Department of Transportation testing and some of the guidelines that I received just this morning from the Nevada State Athletic Commission. So it's very relevant to our expert witness's testimony, who's going to highlight the differences in both the collection methods and the collection analyses at 2 labs accredited by 2 different agencies, one being accredited by WADA, which are these regulations, and the other by the Health and Human Services. So it's directly relevant to the facts of this case.
When was the 3rd sample collected?
So there were 3 specimens, white knight specimens.
Okay.
The first was collected by Jim Guernsey, and the specimen was provided to Smyrtle for testing. That was collected at 7:12 p.m. The second specimen is a post-fight specimen that was collected by Ring Inspector Aldo Galvan. That was sent to Quest for testing, and that was collected at 10:38 p.m. The third specimen was again collected by Jim Guernsey and sent to Smyrtle for testing, and that was collected at 11:55 p.m.
If I may offer a suggestion, it appears that the investigative code may have some probative value to the outcome of this proceeding, and therefore I would suggest to the chair that he admit this exhibit. Simply because it's admitted doesn't mean that we're bound by it, but it just may be used as evidence.
It's admitted.
Oh, yeah, okay. That's number
3rd?
The 3rd would simply be, which is, we'll mark as Diaz Exhibit 3, is the WADA accredited list of accredited laboratories worldwide and in the United States.
Isn't that fine?
It's now 3.
Admitted. Do you have any objection? Thank you. Next exhibit?
We have no further exhibits.
Thank you. Now that all the exhibits have been admitted, and we have gone through the discussion as necessary and made the necessary rulings, we'll now go ahead and proceed with the case. Mr. Eccles?
Yeah, can I just,
Sure.
you gonna hand out copies?
Yeah, just give me a second there. Okay, I think I got a complete package. If I may approach, Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Did you swear? Sorry. Should I give them to you, sir? Sorry.
Okay, just for a point of clarification, you've got Diaz 1, 2, and 5. So you want to renumber this as 3?
Correct. They should be 1, 2, and 3 in order. They were pre-marked before we
Thank you.
cross-referenced the state's exhibits.
Again, it goes to lack of phone system. You're welcome to move the phone back and forth, please. Mr. Bennett, you're welcome to carry the phone back and forth between the attorneys and security.
Unless I put it on a chair and then, unless
I prefer to have the phone on their table and our table when
you
necessary.
prefer to have what?
The phone on their table
Okay.
and our table when necessary. It might have to go around you, Pat. Sorry. This thing go.
Not just like Fight Pack. Mr. Eccles.
Mr. Eccles, you ready?
I was just waiting for the documents to be given to me as well.
All right.
Get right to it. I'm going to call Dr. Barry's sample. He's already been sworn in to testify. Dr. Sample, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you please tell us your, start out with your full name, spell your last name for the record, please.
It's R.H. Harry Sample, and last name spelled S-A-M-P-L-E.
Can you tell us who your current employer is?
Quest Diagnostics.
And in what capacity are you employed by Quest Diagnostics?
I'm the Director of Science and Technology for the Employer Solutions business at Quest Diagnostics. And I am also the Scientific Director under the College of American Pathologists Forensic Drug Testing Accreditation Program for the Lenexa, Kansas laboratory, as well as the Nevada Licensed Director for that laboratory.
Okay. Can you tell us about how long you've held your position?
I've been with Quest Diagnostics since July of 1991, and I've held my current position as the Director of Science and Technology since April of 2000, and I've been the Scientific Director and Nevada Licensed Director since June of 2010.
And can you tell us the general scope of your duties in your employment with Quest, please?
So it's twofold. One is the Director of Science and Technology. I'm responsible for leading research and development efforts, looking at new technology that we may want to bring into our business for performing our workplace drug testing and testing of other substances that may be misused or abused by people in sports or in workplace settings. And as the Director of the Lenexa Laboratory, I'm responsible for all of the scientific and technical operations at the laboratory.
Can you tell us your the degrees that you hold, please?
Sure. I have a bachelor's in chemistry from Indiana University. I completed those studies in December of 1977, and I have a PhD in pharmacology, also from Indiana University, and I completed those studies in July of 1985.
Have you ever been certified to testify as an expert toxicologist in a court of law?
I have.
Okay. Now, have you had time to review the laboratory packet produced by Quest with regard to Mr. Diaz's specimen on January 31 of this year?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And have you had the time to form a professional opinion regarding the data and the results of that specimen?
So my review of the data packet would indicate that all the laboratory procedures were properly followed. We performed two-tiered testing. There's an immunoassay screen followed by a gas chromatograph mass spectral confirmation analysis. All of the quality control, all of the chain of custody documentation was intact and supports the reporting of a positive test on the urine sample in question.
All right. Me move that he be qualified to testify as an expert toxicologist.
Any objection?
No objection.
Thank you. Accepted.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sample. I just wanted to make sure your testimony was recognized as being that of an expert. Can you, so it's my understanding that Quest found the parameters to be normal and that there's a procedure methodology by which you perform your testing, and that the first step of that involves what's called an immunoassay test, and that is what was done here. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you describe what an immunoassay test is, please, and how it relates to the Diaz specimen on January 31?
So immunoassay screening tests are initial testing procedures that are designed to rapidly eliminate negatives from further consideration. So in the case of looking for marijuana metabolite, there is an antibody that has been developed as directed toward the primary metabolite of marijuana, the delta-9 carboxylic acid. If there's any drug present in the urine specimen that's being tested, that antibody reacts with the drug. It produces a response that's measurable, and any response equal to or greater than the designated cutoff would be considered presumptively positive and then subject to confirmatory testing using definitive technology, and in this case that's gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, or GCMS.
Okay, so can you describe what was the result of the immunoassay screen test with regard to Diaz's specimen?
The specimen was presumptively positive on the screen, and perhaps the easiest thing to look at, if you care to refer to the documentation package, is if you look at page 20 of that documentation package. Let me know if people are looking at it and when they had a chance to turn to that page, and I'll continue.
Mr. Eccles, if I'm correct, this is the 8:30 test that was conducted on fight night?
The January 31 test,
At
it was
8:30.
10:38.
10:38.
Yes, he gave the specimen at 10:38 p.m. And Dr.
Is there one at
Samples,
11 as well then?
there was one later at 11:55.
Oh,
So
okay.
about an hour and 17 minutes later.
But there are 3 tests.
Yes,
This is the second of the 3.
This is the second one.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
And so Dr. Sample is referring to page 20 on State's Exhibit 1. And feel free to describe to the commission what that page shows us, Doctor.
Certainly. This is what we refer to as the batch certification report, and it provides a summary of all of the quality control, blind QC, and unknown samples, specimens that were analyzed as part of that analytical batch. So if you're looking at a cup 1, would be a below threshold control, listing all of the analytes, and the data is presented such that anything that has a response equal to or greater than the cutoff would have a value of 1 or more. So in other words, the results are normalized to 1. So a value of less than 1 would indicate that it is a negative specimen, or perhaps a drug, some amount of drug might be present, but it's below cutoff. So the first cup that you see here is for the below threshold control. down to line, to cup 22, which is the specimen identified as being provided by Mr. Diaz. And you see it says THC equals, and then there's a parentheses 1.423, and THPH in this context stands for pending high. So that means the specimen was presumptively positive for marijuana metabolite, and while the immunoassay screening test is not quantitative, it's by its nature basically a qualitative test, the response on this test was well above the screening cutoff of 50 nanograms per mil.
Okay. Now, I just want to be clear, can you tell us the integrity checks that Quest performed on this specimen?
So this specimen would have also been tested for pH and creatinine.
Okay, and let's just take the creatinine first. What does the creatinine level tell you about the specimen?
The creatinine is used as an indicator of how dilute the specimen is. Somewhat referring to specific gravity. Our standard is to use creatinine rather than specific gravity. It's a test that's well recognized in the industry. It's easily automated and provides very accurate and reliable indication of the degree of dilution. And in the event that we have an abnormally low creatinine, then we also perform a specific gravity. So for the reporting of the dilute specimen, it's really a two-pronged approach requiring that both creatinine and specific gravity be below certain thresholds in order to report the specimen as dilute.
Okay, so for creatinine, I see there's an acceptable range of greater than or equal to 20 milligrams per deciliter. Is that right?
Anything less than 20 milligrams per deciliter would then be suspected of being potentially dilute and would require a specific gravity analysis.
Okay, and so Diaz's creatinine level reported on this report is 168.4. What does that tell you about the dilution of the specimen?
At a value of in the 160 or so milligrams per deciliter, based on analysis that we've done in the past of millions of creatinine results, that's a little over the median. So that the median value is the point at which half the results are greater than that number and half the results are less than that number. So the median value for creatinine, when we've looked at this in the past, is somewhere around 120 or 130 milligrams per deciliter. So it's really right in the middle of the range of values we're accustomed to seeing.
And how can you describe for us a relationship between dilution and the hydration of the athlete that gave the specimen?
Well, I mean, the concentration of creatinine, the specific gravity in the urine is clearly related to the amount of fluid intake. The more fluid that somebody consumes or normally consumes, the greater the dilution of the urine, and therefore the lower the creatinine and the lower the specific gravity. Conversely, somebody who is not well hydrated or doesn't ordinarily consume a lot of fluid would tend to have higher creatinine and specific gravity values.
Okay, so tell me if I'm saying this right. If the higher the creatinine is, then that would mean that the athlete's urine is concentrated, and therefore the athlete is less hydrated. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and so
The higher the creatinine, generally speaking, the lower the hydration level, and the more concentrated the urine is.
Okay. So can you characterize, just once again, what would you describe as Diaz's hydration level if his creatinine is at 168.4?
A little bit above the median value based on our studies that we've performed in the past.
Okay, so is it fair to say that he's hydrated?
He's neither significantly overhydrated or underhydrated, so it's more or less in the middle.
Okay, thank you. I want to move along to, you described that he was presumptively positive on the immunoassay. So having determined that, tell us what the next step is in Quest analyzing the specimen.
So the next step would be to remove another portion of the original specimen for confirmatory testing to prepare for analysis by the GCMS or gas chromatography mass spectrometric method in order to specifically identify and quantify the drug or drug metabolite that's present in the specimen.
Okay, so after you have the presumptively positive, the next part of analyzing is GCMS, correct?
Correct.
And from that, you're able to gather a quantitative number of the metabolites in the specimen, is that right?
Did you say metabolite or metabolites? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you correctly.
Metabolite.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, and tell us what Quest reported as the quantitative value regarding the GCMS result.
We reported greater than 300 nanograms per milliliter. And if you look at page stamp 52 of the documentation package.
Page
52. Okay, we're there.
Okay. You see where it says concentration says 733.23 nanograms per milliliter. So that was the concentration that was reported by the GCMS instrumentation. However, that level is higher than our upper limit of linearity, which means that all we can reliably say about the result is that it's greater than 300 nanograms per milliliter, which is our upper limit of linearity. It may or may not be 733, might be something more, might be something less, but it's certainly well above our upper limit of linearity of 300 nanograms per mil. And in reviewing the data on this page, we can tell that all the identification criteria was met and all chromatography was acceptable.
Okay, so in your professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, are the screening immunoassay results consistent with the confirmatory GCMS results?
Yes, they are.
Okay. I have a few more questions. One, can you tell the commission what type of certification, is there an outside agency that you are certified by with regard to drug of abuse testing?
So the Lemexa laboratory is certified and accredited by a variety of organizations. So there's the National Laboratory Certification Program for urine drug testing, which is a required certification for performing any federally mandated testing. So that would include not only testing of federal employees, but also testing that's mandated by the U.S. Department of Transportation or the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The laboratory is also accredited by the College of American Pathologists under their forensic drug testing accreditation program, and that accreditation is for urine testing, hair testing, and oral fluid testing. The laboratory is also accredited under the New York State Department of Health in forensic toxicology. All three of those programs have proficiency testing programs where the laboratory is sent blind specimens. They know the proficiency test, but they don't know the content or the concentration to assess their performance. All three programs involve on-site inspections where inspectors come into the laboratory, review standard operating procedures, they review data packs to ensure that the laboratory is performing and testing specimens and reporting them correctly. And we also hold licensure under a variety of other states, including Nevada, Pennsylvania, Florida, and others. However, those programs don't also include on-site inspections.
Okay, and in your experience with Quest, do you work with medical review officers?
Yes, we do.
Can you tell us the general scope of your working relationship with the MROs and the scope of their work?
So as a laboratory, I'm sorry, I heard some noise on the line.
We can still hear you.
Okay. As a laboratory, we do not have a direct relationship with medical review officers, and in fact, due to the potential conflict of interest, it's absolutely prohibited under federal testing programs to have any sort of relationship between a laboratory and a medical review officer. So, for instance, we don't employ them or hire them or direct our customers to use any specific medical review officer. So that the role of the medical review officer is to act as an independent resource that the laboratory would report the results to. The role of the medical review officer would be to review the lab results, review the specimen, external chain of custody to ensure that that documentation is intact, that there wasn't a problem at the collection site or the laboratory didn't miss something when they reviewed the external specimen chain of custody. And then for non-negative test results, to interview the donor and determine if there's an alternative medical explanation for the laboratory finding.
In your understanding, is it also that the MRO's job to inform the donor that they have the ability to test a B specimen?
Objection leading.
They would offer, yes, they could offer that to the donor as part of their review process.
Okay. And just one other question about this process as far as your understanding of the MROs. If an MRO receives a positive abnormal report from the lab, if the donor of the specimen doesn't request the B testing, if the MRO does not find an alternative medical explanation for the result, is it the MRO's job to then report the result of the A to the employer?
I'm not aware of a donor ever requesting to have a B specimen tested when the MRO determines that there's an alternative medical explanation for example, a valid prescription for the drug reported by the laboratory. And I'm sorry, what was the second half of your question?
Sorry, it's a long one. If the MRO determines that there is no valid alternative medical explanation, and the donor hasn't requested the B to be tested, is it your understanding then that the results of the A stand?
Those are the results that would be reported to the customer, the employer or other end user of those results. So absent a request for a reanalysis of the A specimen when only an A was collected, or the analysis of the B or split specimen when a split specimen was collected, absent a request for such a retest or reconfirmation, the medical review officer would report the results to the employer or whoever's requesting the test.
Okay. Now, did Diaz request the results of his B specimen to be tested to your knowledge?
And not to my knowledge, we didn't receive receive a request to test the feed method.
Okay, thank you. I want to quickly ask you a few questions about what's been admitted as State's Exhibit 8. And that includes LabCorp final reports. Do you have those available to you, Dr. Sample?
I do. Give me just 1 second. I have those, and I believe it's the first one from January 23rd.
Yes. Now, I put this together as one exhibit because I'm going to ask questions that relate to the exhibits as a packet. So, Dr. Sample.
Can I object first on the foundation as the basis for this testimony? Was he the certifying scientist on these reports, or is his knowledge simply that he's reviewed this one-page report?
What's the basis for your objection?
Foundation.
Are you asking a question?
No,
as
the
far as-
objection is foundation.
All right, and so your objection is lack of foundation.
It
Is
is.
that correct?
That's correct.
I would overrule on that.
Overrule, continue.
Dr. Sample, can you tell us, have you had a chance to review the LabCorp final report dated 1/23 from Mr. Diaz?
I'm just looking at the date here. There's a specimen collected on 1/23. It appears to be reported on February 1st.
Yes, and then the next specimen was collected on 1/26, and it was reported on 1/28.
Correct.
Have you had a chance to review that page?
Yes.
Now, the general area I'm asking about here is how, I want you to explain to the commission, if you can, given that you're a toxicologist here, regarding the January 23 specimen. What can you tell us about the creatinine level on that specimen?
The creatinine on this specimen was reported as 309.8 milligrams per deciliter. It's flagged as high on the laboratory report. The reference interval reported by the laboratory is 20 to 300.
Okay, and with that level creatinine, what does that tell you about the athlete's hydration?
It would say that the specimen, urine specimen was concentrated.
And am I correct that the specimen was confirmed positive at greater than 300 by GCMS on this result?
Yes, it says carboxy THC, GCMS, meaning confirmation, and a result of greater than 300.
Okay, so just kind of in general terms, the urine specimen is concentrated and he's at greater than 300 nanograms per mil, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now if I could have you turn the page to the January 26 specimen.
Okay.
Can you describe his hydration level, given that his creatinine is reported at 240.1?
It is at the upper end of what we ordinarily see in our testing, but it's not as high as it was on the previous one.
So again, in general terms, could you say that the urine specimen is fairly concentrated?
It's above the midpoint.
Yet he is negative with a cutoff of 50, meaning he was 49 or less. Is that the way to interpret this page?
So the screening test for the cannabinoid, but for the screening test for the marijuana metabolite in this urine specimen was negative, which means that the total response that was measured on that immunoassay screening test would have been something less than 15 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. Now just to tie...
Or quite frankly, it could be totally negative. It's just some response less.
Okay.
I'm not clear, Mr. Eccles, on the answer as to 240.1 creatine, what that meant as to hydration or lack of hydration.
Okay. So Dr. Sample, can you explain again really clearly in layman's terms to us what does it mean that he has a 240 creatinine level.
Great. So it means that the concentration of creatinine was on the upper end of what we may expect to see in urine workplace drug tests. And in fact, in our data, a value of 240 milligrams per deciliter would be, you don't get up to that level until 92%, 90% or more of the specimens have a creatinine level of less than that. So it's at the upper 10% of the values that we typically see. So it's clearly more concentrated than what we saw in our testing for the specimen that we discussed previously.
Okay, and I'll get to that specimen next, but I just want to be clear about, is it accurate to say that on the January 23rd specimen, the urine is really concentrated, correct?
Yes.
And then on the January 26th specimen, he's negative, he's less than 50, but the urine is also towards the upper end in that it's fairly concentrated. He's fairly dehydrated at the time he gave the specimen. Is that reasonable to say that?
It's fairly it is. The second specimen is still quite concentrated relative to what we normally see. It's in the upper 10% of value.
Okay.
Whereas in our analysis, the greater than 300 represents something less than 5% of all specimens.
Right, and so now moving on to Quest specimen on January 31, the creatinine is 168.4, and that is about within the normal range. Is that right?
It's a little bit above the midpoint, so yes.
Okay, yet he's positive at greater than 300. So what I'm looking for you to do is to tie together the LabCorp results where he's dehydrated on the 23rd. He's greater than 300 is the result. 3 days later, he's still fairly concentrated or dehydrated on the urine, yet he's under 50. And then again on Quest Fight Night testing, he's about in the median range for creatinine, indicating he's about normal hydration. Yet again, he's above 300. So can you kind of tie all those together for us and sort of explain that to us?
It is next to impossible to tie together different specimens collected at different points in time, particularly collected over different days. So, all you can say is that on the first LabCorp specimen, there was a high concentration of THC, the combined THC in the donor specimen. On that second test, if there was any THC metabolite present, it was less than the cutoff. And then on the subsequent test that we performed on the 31st, again, there was a very high concentration of THC measured.
Okay, and I think I just have one other question, then I'll be conclude that with the witness. And I don't know if you can answer it, Dr. Sample, but given the creatinine levels in this series of tests, is it possible that Mr. Diaz had used the drug from the date of the 26th, where you have concentrated specimen and is negative, to the date of the 31st, where you have basically a median hydration level and he's positive?
So is it possible? It is certainly possible. What I can tell you about the clearance of THC is that it's very dependent upon an individual's usage pattern and the concentration of drug that's being used, their usage pattern, the degree of hydration. typically, if you have somebody who's a very infrequent user, they may be negative within several days after using the drug, whereas somebody who is a very heavy user could tend to remain positive for a number of weeks after cessation of use. So there are probably not a whole lot of firm conclusions that you can draw from that, but given the nature of the concentration, it might be suggestive of reuse. But again, it is difficult to tell with any degree of certainty.
Okay, do you have anything else that you wanted to add about Quest's analysis of the specimen?
No.
Okay. I don't have further questions for Dr. Sample.
I have some questions for the doctor.
Thank you.
Dr. Sample, my name is Lucas Middlebrook. I'm an attorney for Mr. Diaz. I'm going to ask you some questions. If you don't understand, let me know. I'm happy to rephrase, okay?
Sure.
You talked a little bit, you testified a little bit about the immunoassay screen. And what majority of testing, of your lab's testing, is under the authority of the Department of Transportation?
Roughly 20% or so of the urine drug test.
Okay, and under those, I'm sorry.
Under DOT auspices.
Okay, and under those auspices, am I correct that the cutoff level for the immunoassay is 50 nanograms per milliliter and the GCMS confirmation is 15?
That is correct.
Okay, so we typically we see the initial test level, the immunoassay, is higher than the confirmation test level. Isn't that correct?
In the case of marijuana metabolite, that is, and some other drugs, that's the case, yes.
Right, because the GCMS is looking for a single metabolite once the immunoassay has kind of done its broad look, so to speak.
There may be other structurally or pharmacologically related substances of the urine that might react to immunoassay.
Okay, and so what I've really been trying to figure out for a while now is if you look at page 56 of State 1, which is the Quest litigation packet from this matter, why is the initial immunoassay 100, yet the confirmatory is 150? To me, that would seem to be backwards.
I'm sorry, which page are you on?
Page 56 of what's been marked as State Exhibit 1. It's the Quest litigation packet from Mr. Diaz's test.
But, okay, so your question is why do we screen at 100 and confirm at 150?
That's correct.
Okay. So under our laboratory certification and accreditation requirements, and also based on FDA, Food and Drug Administration requirements for the use of the immunoassay screening tests for drugs of abuse, we are required to use immunoassay screening kits when we're using those types of kits that have been cleared or otherwise recognized by the US FDA. And the highest screening level of an FDA cleared kit for marijuana metabolite from the manufacturers that we utilize is 100 nanograms per mil. So that's why we screen at 100.
Okay.
To screen at a higher level, we cannot do so in an FDA compliant manner.
Okay, and your lab's not accredited by the World Anti-Doping Association, correct?
No.
Now, you mentioned with respect to Mr. Diaz's creatinine concentration, as indicated on page 56, same page, 168.4 milligrams per deciliter. I believe your testimony was, quote, it was a little over the median. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So would you agree with me that by looking at that creatinine concentration, at that point when it was collected, Mr. Diaz was either euhydrated or slightly dehydrated?
Was
He was either euhydrated or slightly dehydrated?
So you mean by euhydrated that he was, close to normal?
Correct.
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And in speaking of hydration, I believe you testified that a lab such as Quest would only go to specific gravity if in the event you had a creatinine value of below 20 milligrams per deciliter. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you're familiar with specific gravity and how it measures hydration?
Yes.
Okay. And if we had two values of specific, if I gave you two values of specific gravity, could you tell me which one showed a more hydrated individual and which one showed a less hydrated individual?
Well, he's a more dilute and a less dilute specimen, yes.
Okay, so if we had figures of 1.002 and 1.009, what do those two specific gravity figures tell you?
So 1.002 is a low specific gravity. And in fact, in our testing for reporting of a dilute specimen that I referred to earlier, that would be half the criteria for reporting a dilute. Because for us to report a dilute specimen requires a creatinine less than 20 and a specific gravity less than 1.003.
Okay, so am I correct that the closer we get to 1, the more hydrated the individual would be to produce that specific gravity reading?
Within physiological capability, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So, water has a specific gravity of 1.000.
Oh, okay, perfect, thank you. And your testimony was a little bit about what medical review officers do, primarily in the context of Department of Transportation and non-regulated employment testing that follows, or closely follows, DOT protocol. And I believe you said that they review the chain of custody forms, they review the lab's chain of custody documentation, and they review both non-negative and negative results. Is that correct?
So that's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And are you aware whether a medical review officer reviewed the results from the Quest litigation packet that we see in State Exhibit 1?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so it didn't have that extra layer of independent analysis, did it?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. And with respect to DOT or non-regulated testing, isn't it fair to say that we rarely see multiple consecutive tests from the same donor in a short period of time?
It's not unheard of, but it's unusual, yes.
Okay. And you testified a little bit with respect to State 8, which were the LabCorp results. But just to be clear, you're not the certifying scientist at LabCorp, correct?
That's correct.
And you can't testify to anything but the numbers that LabCorp produced on these two documents, correct?
I can't make any comments other than what's directly on those documents.
Okay. Did you review the two other specimen results that were taken from Mr. Diaz on January 31st that were analyzed by the Smyrtle lab?
So I've seen the laboratory documentation package provided by the Smyrtle Laboratory.
Okay. And you've reviewed the final concentrations from both of those collections?
Yes, I have.
And you would recognize, would you not, that there was a large discrepancy between what your lab produced and what the Smyrtle labs produced?
There's a large difference between those three results, yes.
Okay, no further questions.
One question before you let Dr. Sample go is whether or not that the B sample was either tested or was requested to be tested. Dr. Sample, was there any testing of the B sample?
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Did Quest do any testing of the B sample?
No, we did not. We were not asked to analyze the B specimen.
Thank you. And Chris, was there a request to analyze the request B sample?
No.
Thank you.
Are you done with
I don't
doctors?
have any redirect.
Okay,
Nothing further.
thank you.
We call Dr. Daniel Eichner. Dr. Eichner, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So we, you lay a foundation on it? Okay. So, Dr. Eichner, I need to quickly lay a foundation for your ability to testify as an expert toxicologist. So can you please briefly summarize your well, I guess I should start off with, tell us your name and spell your last name.
Daniel Eichner, E-I-T-H-N-E-R.
Who's your employer?
Sports Medicine Research and Testing Laboratory.
And tell us your job title with, I'm going to refer to that as Smyrtle.
I'm the president of Smyrtle. I'm in charge of all testing of samples in the lab and research and staffing.
Okay, can you tell us your professional degrees, please?
I have a bachelor's degree in science and a PhD in medical science.
And how long have you been in your present position with Smyrtle?
4 years now.
Okay. Can you tell us anything else about your background that qualifies you believe, to testify as an expert?
Sure. So prior to being president of Smyrtle, I was the science director at the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And prior to that, I was the chief science officer of the Australian Sports Anti-Doping Authority. And the Smyrtle Laboratory in Salt Lake City is one of 2 World Anti-Doping Agency accredited laboratories in the country. And we do testing for all Olympic sports and some professional sports, as well as forensic work. And we specialize in performance-enhancing drug testing.
Is that enough? Okay, so I think I've laid the foundation. His testimony is that of an expert toxicologist. Dr. Eichner, I just want to quickly ask you a few questions here.
Is there any objection to that, counsel?
No objection.
Thank you.
I was waiting for the proffer.
Sorry, a little informal.
Okay.
From a technical standpoint, in Nevada, you don't have to make the proffer.
Duly noted.
Dr. Eichner, are you familiar with Smyrtle producing a laboratory document package for specimens provided by Mr. Diaz on January 31 of this year?
So I'm familiar with the documentation package that we refer to with unique lab ID numbers, and I would have only been made aware of the name that sample belongs to well after the fact that we did the analysis. But I understand now that the documentation package we submitted was for Mr. Diaz. That's correct.
Okay. So do you have that in front of you?
You know what? I'm actually having some technical issues. I only have one power adapter for Switzerland, and unfortunately my phone was running out, so I can only talk or use computer at one time. So I'm familiar with the documentation package, but unfortunately I didn't print one out, and so I have to confess I can't see and talk at the same time.
Did you review that documentation prior to testifying today?
Yes, I did, and I also review all cases before they go out of the lab as well.
Okay, well, let me try and just ask you a few questions about it. I want to tie these records together for the commission. And I'm going to do this by referring to certain pages for the commission, even though the doctor doesn't have it. But if the commission could turn to page 4 of 19 of State's Exhibit 2. I just want to point out, regarding what Dr. Eichner just said, their protocol is such that they don't know the identity of the athlete until after, such as in litigation like this. But there's a specimen ID number that Smyrtle uses to track these specimens. That specimen ID number is given by the collector, and in this case, you can see that is ending 2693 at the top right of the page. And then if you go down to the bottom of that page, you can see that there is a blacked out portion, and there is another number that's been attached to it, and that ends in 396-1. And so what I'm doing here is just showing the commission that if you want to see and track Smyrtle's concentration of the THC regarding these specimens, make the connection between that number 396 by looking at page 16.
And just for informative purposes, Mr. Eccles, the A that's on here, does this have any correlation to the A or B samples?
I don't know.
Okay.
What I want to point out, the top left, you'll see data file, and you see that number that was previously referred to on page 4. You see it ends 396. And so now you can see that there's a custody and control form, and there's a quantitative analysis sample report. Now,
What's your point, Chris?
my point is, Dr. Eichner, do you recall that in the, I'm referring now to the post-fight urine specimen. This was given at 11:55 p.m. at night according to the control form. Do you recall that?
Yes, I did.
Do you recall that there is a final concentration reported by Smyrtle regarding that specimen?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have the number in front of me, but I definitely reviewed it several times.
Okay, and when we're talking about the marijuana metabolite, would that be reported on your sample report as THC with a final concentration number for this post-fight specimen is 61.104?
That's correct.
Okay. If the commission is having any issue seeing that, I can point it out. That final concentration is basically on the top right. It's right above that first top right graph. You can.
We got it.
Okay.
Let's go.
All right, Dr. Eichner, do you recall there's a specific gravity associated with this of 1.009?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Now, what can you tell us about that specific gravity? Does that mean that the specimen was concentrated or dilute?
1.009 would be indicative of a urine that is more dilute than we would normally see. A regular sample we would see would have a specific gravity of about 1.020. So 1.009 would be significantly lower than that and more dilute.
Okay, and what's the relationship between the urine being dilute and the concentration of the THC metabolite?
So when you're measuring a THC metabolite in urine, the way that our standard operating procedure goes, and again we're accredited by ISO 17025 and also the World Anti-Doping Agency, is if we deal with a threshold substance like marijuana, we do not normalize the specific gravity. So if the specific gravity is low and it's a dilute urine, that THC concentration could be lower than what we'd be seeing if the same individual at the same time had a high specific gravity or more concentrated urine.
Okay, so I'm referring to page 17. There's a final concentration of 49.731, and let me make the representation to the commission that this relates to the pre-fight specimen collected by Smyrtle, or by Jim Guernsey, given to Smyrtle at 7:12 p.m. on fight night. And Dr. Eichner, what can you tell us about the specific gravity being 1.002 and how that may affect your detection of the THC metabolite?
So 1.002 specific gravity is a very dilute urine, and as Dr. Sample just specified, 1.00 is water. So we're dealing with a very dilute urine. And again, like I said before, is that when we're dealing with a threshold substance like marijuana,
we do not normalize specific gravity. So the concentration of the urine can really affect the concentration of the marijuana metabolite that we see in the urine. So if we tested the same individual, and again, you have to understand our process, we wouldn't know that two samples provided on the same day came from the same assay. We don't have a linking way to know that. So we would have analyzed them independently. But looking at the data we have now, we can see that a specific gravity of 1.002 is significantly lower than 1.009, and therefore you would expect to see a lower concentration of marijuana metabolite than you would if the specific gravity was higher at 1.009 that we saw slightly before that sample was provided.
Okay, so in your professional opinion, to a scientific degree of certainty here, does it appear consistent to you that when you have a specific gravity that's very low of 1.002 and a concentration of 49, is that consistent with the other tests performed by Smyrtle where the specific gravity is slightly higher and the concentration is also slightly higher?
I think it's impossible to directly correlate exactly, but it's definitely consistent with that finding, that's for sure.
Okay. Is it your testimony that this...
So your point is that the greater hydration creates a lesser amount of THC?
Yes, that's the point. Do you have anything else to add about your testing of the two specimens at issue here?
No, the only thing I just want to remind the Commission is that, we specialize in performance-enhancing drug testing, and some of the drugs do cross over in Department of Transportation testing, illicit drug testing programs. But just importantly, we do not do immunoassays for a screen. We only do mass spectrometry. And so I think that, the screening data is going to be more consistent when you do mass spec both ways. But the mass spectrometry data that we do for the confirmation should definitely be consistent with other regulated programs like Quest and LabCorp, I would expect.
I don't have further questions.
I just have a few. Dr. Eichner, my name is Lucas Middlebrook, attorney for Nicholas Diaz. You mentioned at the outset of your testimony that when the specimens arrive at your lab, they contain a unique lab ID and that you don't know the athlete's name till well after the fact. Do you remember that?
That's correct.
Can you explain to me why that is?
Well, it's important when we do the analysis that we're blinded to what we're testing for. In many instances, we may know the sport because some sports will have a different testing panel, but it's very important that the people doing the analyses are blinded and can never be perceived to be biased in any way. So we use a unique lab ID, and that way we've never been accused of ever knowing before the sample was reported.
And to be accredited by WADA, am I correct that the specimen collectors under WADA they're called sample collection personnel, that they are following WADA collection guidelines, is that correct?
So the World Anti-Doping Agency accredits laboratories, and they also have guidelines, practices for the doping control officers. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And just a little bit on the specific gravity of these specimens. I believe if you had the paperwork, if you look at pages 4 and 5, which are the specimen collection forms that were used on Mr. Diaz on the two collections, the one pre-fight collection taken at 7:12 p.m., the specific gravity is listed as 1.002, and the second post-fight specimen taken at 11:55 p.m. has a specific gravity level of 1.009. Is that your recollection?
That's correct.
So am I correct that by 11:55 p.m., Mr. Diaz still had not returned to his pre-fight hydration levels of 1.002?
So the specific gravity of 1.002 is indicative of someone who's very, very hydrated. And during the bout, or the exercise the individual was doing, several hours later, the specific gravity being 1.009, is still, I would classify as someone who's more hydrated than normal, but nowhere near as hydrated as the 1.002. But remembering that 1.020 is what we consider normal, specific gravity for an individual.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned, just last question, you mentioned you don't do the immunoassay screening for the metabolites, but you go straight to the GCMS, is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that a 150 milligram per deciliter confirmation cutoff level of the THC metabolite?
So, as per the law anti-doping act, marijuana is prohibited at a threshold of 150 nanograms per mil. So that would be our screen cutoff as well.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have two quick questions, please. Dr. Eigner, when you do the GCMS review and an athlete's sample does not test above the limit, is there any type of numerical indication as to what it may be, even if it is less than the numerical limit that has been established by WADA?
No, because it's considered a threshold substance. If it doesn't meet our criteria, it doesn't meet that threshold, then there would be no point to do a confirmation analysis on there, and it would be reported out as negative. Again, just because it's a threshold substance, it has to meet that threshold, and if it doesn't, then it will be reported as negative.
Second question, was there any testing of the B samples by Smyrtle?
I do not believe we were instructed to test any B samples.
And Chris, was there any request then to test the B samples?
No.
Thank you. No further questions.
I do have one follow-up in response to the Commissioner's questioning. Just so that it's clear on the record with respect to the concentration analysis, the results that Smyrtle releases to, in this instance, the Commission, is just going to say whether there were any prohibited substances detected or not, correct?
That's correct.
Right. But if we find ourselves in a hearing such as this or some other contested hearing and an individual requests the documentation package, from that package we can see the concentration values that were found in that specimen, correct?
Yes, an expert should be able to determine that and extrapolate from the data that we provide.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mr. Eccles?
I don't have further witnesses.
Thank you. Mr. Middlebrook?
We are just going to have one witness here today, which is going to be Dr. Kella. But before I start his questioning, I would just like to give an overview, if you would indulge me. Moving to the merits of the charge that by his administration or use of a prohibited substance, which is alleged to have occurred in competition on January 31st, 2015, based on a single post-fight test showing a positive result for marijuana, no discipline is justified because that test is scientifically unreliable. First, despite having knowledge that Mr. Diaz submitted to 3 separate collections on the night of his fight, the Commission chose only to mention and attach the results to the complaint from the Quest lab, which you see is an inexplicable outlier. Mr. Diaz was tested once pre-fight at 7:12 p.m., and that collection was completed by specimen collector Jim Guernsey using WADA collection methods sent to a WADA accredited lab, Smyrtle. That test returned a result of 49.731 nanograms per milliliter of THC, more than 100 nanograms per milliliter below the applicable cutoff level. And as reported by Smyrtle, quote, no prohibited substances or their metabolites were detected, end quote. Mr. Diaz was then tested twice following the fight. Tests that were collected using completely different collection methods and sent to 2 completely different laboratories, accredited by different agencies, which produced dramatically different results. At 10:38 p.m., Mr. Diaz had his urine collected by an entirely different collector, Mr. Aldo Galvan, using a non-WADA specimen collection form. A form that, after hearing the testimony of Dr. Iker, destroyed the anonymity of the testing process by placing Mr. Diaz, a well-known athlete, his name, on the front and center of the laboratory paperwork, in direct contravention of WADA sample guidelines, and for that matter, any DOT or regulated guidelines as well. That specimen was sent to Quest, which I mentioned is not a WADA accredited lab, and produced a result of 733.23 nanograms per milliliter, a result nearly 15 times higher than the first pre-fight collection taken at 7:12 p.m. But, unfortunately, this disparity gets worse. Mr. Diaz was then subject to a third test of the evening, another post-fight collection, this one taken at 11:55 p.m. Less than an hour and 20 minutes following the Quest collection. Yet this collection was completed by the same collector that did Mr. Diaz's first pre-fight collection. He also used a WADA protocol form and sent it to a WADA lab. And that result, an hour and 20 minutes after the Quest result, was wholly inconsistent with the Quest result, yet completely consistent with the first pre-fight test. The 11:55 p.m. collection returned a result from Smyrtle of 61.104 nanograms per milliliter, which is nearly 12 times less than the Quest result collected from Mr. Diaz only an hour and 17 minutes prior. Again, close to 100 nanograms per milliliter under the applicable cutoff levels. And as reported by Smyrtle, again, quote, no prohibited substances or their metabolites were detected. Now, the commission, through counsel, has intimated that this decrease could be attributed to Mr. Diaz being dehydrated after the fight at 10:38 p.m. and thereafter rehydrating to a level by 11:55 that would enable him to drastically reduce that THC value from 733 to 61, a reduction of about 672 nanograms per milliliter. This argument is not only factually incorrect, it is medically implausible. You will hear testimony from a medical doctor and a certified medical review officer that reviews more than 25,000 urinalysis drug test results each month, that in order to reduce the THC metabolites that drastically in a time period by way of hydration of an hour and 20 minutes, the person would be suffering from severe water intoxication, and as a result could be suffering from medical symptoms as severe as seizure and ultimately death. Mr. Diaz simply was not exhibiting any of those severe symptoms. Moreover, factually, the various tests will show that Mr. Diaz, as we mentioned here with Dr. Iker, had not even reached his pre-fight hydration levels by 11:55 p.m. His specific gravity will show us that, and his luteinizing hormone values will show us that as well. There is simply no medically plausible explanation for the Quest result of 733 nanograms per milliliter. None whatsoever. Yet in arbitrary and capricious fashion, this commission has filed a disciplinary complaint against Mr. Diaz in a situation where two test results from a WADA-approved lab produced negative results. Negative results that bookended the erroneous result within a matter of hours. Yet the complaint makes absolutely no mention of those two negative tests. None whatsoever. At best, this is an ostrich-like head-in-the-sand mistake. At worst, this is a gross and blatant misrepresentation of the facts. With all due respect, if the commission imposes discipline based on the complaint as written, which wholly ignores the two negative tests, they're depriving this man of his earnings and his future ability to earn a living. It's not only the highest form of administrative abuse of discretion, but it's ripe for judicial review and reversal. And with that, I would like to move into Dr. Kella's testimony. Dr. Kella, can you state your name for the record, please?
Dr. Hani Joseph Kella.
And have you prepared a copy of your CV for submission in this case?
I have.
Okay, so if we could take a look at exhibits, got a little shuffled around here this morning. I believe it's still Diaz Exhibit 1. And can you identify Diaz Exhibit 1, please?
Sure, this is my curriculum vitae.
And can you briefly summarize your educational background, please?
Sure, I have a Bachelor's of Science degree from Villanova University and a medical doctorate degree from Albany Medical College.
And did you receive any postgraduate training?
I did. I completed a residency in family medicine in Norristown, Pennsylvania.
And are you currently licensed to practice medicine?
I hold 2 medical licenses, one in the state of New Jersey and one in the state of Florida.
And who is your current employer?
IMT.
And what does IMT stand for?
Industrial Medical Testing.
What type of services does IMT provide?
We provide medical review officer services.
And can you explain to the commission what a medical review officer does?
Sure. I believe Dr. Sample mentioned it, but I'll be more than happy to repeat it. It is a licensed physician that receives and reviews drug test results from laboratories for employers' drug testing programs. Additionally, evaluates medical explanations for certain drug test results. Is also an independent and impartial gatekeeper and advocate for the accuracy and integrity of a drug testing program.
And what is your title or your position at IMT?
I'm the CEO and MRO for IMT.
And can you briefly describe your job responsibilities in those roles?
Sure. I oversee other physicians that work for me, as well as the staff, plus I also conduct MRO reviews.
And where did you work prior to IMT?
I was a staff physician for Doctors Urgent Care in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania. I became the medical director shortly thereafter and remained the medical director from 93 to 98. It transitioned over to Continuum Healthcare, and I remained the medical director, and that then transitioned over to Concentra Healthcare, and I remained there and then left.
And does your CV, as we see in Diaz Exhibit 1, provide a complete listing of your entire employment history?
Yes.
And do you belong to any professional or industry associations?
Yes. I'm board certified in family medicine in 1995, and as well as a medical review officer. I've been recertified every 5 years as a medical review officer, most recent being the beginning of this year.
And in your current role as medical director at IMT and a certified medical review officer, how many drug tests on average per month do you review?
Easily over 26,500 tests on a monthly basis.
And are these tests that you review primarily urinalysis tests?
Majority are.
And of these tests, do they include testing for the marijuana metabolite?
Yes.
And have you previously testified as an expert witness?
I have.
In what type of proceedings?
In front of administrative law judges as well as the NLRB.
And in those hearings, what was the subject matter of your testimony?
They were collection procedural errors, validity of testing, and interpretation of drug tests.
I would like to offer Dr. Keller as an expert in the interpretation of urinalysis drug test results, in specimen collection procedures and protocol, as well as the validity of those results.
Objection, he's not a toxicologist. He hasn't talked anything about his methodology. For it to be relevant to this commission's determination, it has to be proven that he's talking about a scientifically reliable methodology.
Duly noted.
In other words, what's the error rate? What's his methodology? Has it been in peer-reviewed journals? Is it something that's been subject to testing and retesting? Did he create this methodology just for the purposes of this hearing? Those are the factors that would normally be taken into consideration. I haven't heard anything about his methodology other than he's going to look at what Dr. Sample and Dr. Iker testified to but he's not a toxicologist, so he can only testify as to what's on the face of the documents.
Here in Nevada, you don't need to do a proffer when it comes to the areas in which an expert may wish to offer testimony. It would go to the weight, not to the admissibility.
I think
And
we
so-
could establish the weight of
So, while the objection would be noted, I would suggest that it be overruled.
Overruled, sorry.
Okay.
Am I allowed to ask questions really quick? Am I allowed to ask a couple questions of the witness? Okay. So you review over 26,000 medical records a month.
Correct.
So that's approximately 900 a day. And the amount of time you dedicate to each one is approximately how much?
Well, it depends. If it's a positive test, we have to obviously contact the individual. If it's a negative test, it's an administrative process.
And I understand your majority of your career to date has been a family practice?
Correct.
Okay. What type of training did you go through to interpret drug tests?
Sure. I'm a certified medical review officer. Went through the AAMRO program, American Association of Medical Review Officers. There are only 2 certifying bodies that are out there that perform such, and this is one of them.
Okay. Thank you.
So going through about 900 a day, what's your average workday?
I'm busy, but I'm also computerized.
Well, I understand, but you still have to take a look at each one of those, and
I
Are
have
there
a staff,
certain-
and I have other physicians that work for me.
all right, understood. Have you ever been retained to be able to provide expert testimony in a court of law,
Yes.
separate and apart then from an administrative hearing?
Yes,
And have you been accepted as an expert then
I
in a
have.
court of law? And have you ever been denied the
No.
opportunity to provide testimony then in a court of law?
no.
And where did you provide the testimony?
This is in the state of New York.
On how many occasions?
1.
And what was the topic area?
The topic area was, this is going back years. It was the interpretation of a drug test result.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Dr. Kella, have you reviewed any documents relating to this matter in preparation of your testimony?
I have.
What documents did you review specific to this case?
I reviewed the 2 Smyrtle litigation, two litigation packages, one put forth by Smyrtle, one put forth by Quest, for the collection on Mr. Nicholas Diaz on January 31st of this year. Additionally, I've reviewed the World Anti-Doping Agency's collection procedures, as well as the prohibited list, in addition to the cutoff list.
And in your opinion as an expert, did your review of these documents provide you with a sufficient factual foundation with which to form your opinion?
They did.
You mentioned you reviewed the WADA guidelines for collection of urine samples, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, showing you what has been marked as Diaz Exhibit number 2.
No, that's not.
Are these the WADA guidelines that you reviewed?
Yes.
And if you could please turn to page 71. And specifically, when you're on 71, if you could draw your attention to section D415, and let me know when you're there.
Okay.
Do you see the requirement in D415 that the athlete shall then seal the A and B bottles as directed by the DCO?
I do.
Now, what I would like to do is cross-reference this requirement back to the Quest collection, which I believe is now in a State Exhibit 1. I believe you mentioned it, but did you review State Exhibit 1 as part of your analysis?
Yes, both Smyrtle and the Quest.
Okay. If you could please turn to page 5 of State Exhibit 1.
What is that?
That would be the Quest litigation packet.
It's a chain of custody.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Kella, before we cross-reference, looking at page 5 of State Exhibit 1, is this type of collection form familiar to you?
It's very familiar to me, as this is a Quest non-regulated form for performing collections.
Okay. And under a DOT, Department of Transportation, or non-regulated collections which follow DOT protocol, does the collector or does the donor split the specimen and seal the split vials?
It's always the collector, never the donor.
Now, if we look specifically on page 5 of State Exhibit 1, which is the chain of custody form from the Quest collection, did you form an opinion as to whether this collection followed the guideline that we see in section D415?
I formed an opinion, and my opinion is it did not follow the 415 collection procedure in WADA.
And why did you form that opinion?
If you look at the page 5, I guess, exhibit, State 1 now, page 5. Step 3 clearly says, collector affixes bottle seal to bottle, collector dates and seals bottle. Additionally, in step 5, right above Mr. Nicholas Diaz printed name, it says the bottles were sealed with a tamper evidence seal in his presence. So he clearly did not seal the bottles.
Okay. And if we could move to page 70 on Diaz Exhibit 2. And specifically, if I could draw your attention to section D49, page 70. And Dr. Kella, if you could draw your attention to section D49, do you see the requirement that the DCO/chaperone shall ensure an unobstructed view of the sample leaving the athlete's body and must continue to observe the sample after provision of the sample is securely sealed?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And if we again cross-reference that requirement with the chain of custody form that we see on page 5 of State Exhibit 1, did you form an opinion as to whether that direct observation requirement was followed with respect to this alleged positive test?
Yes, I formed an opinion and it was not followed.
And why did you form that opinion?
If you take a look at State Exhibit 1, page 5, under Step 2, to the extreme right, there's a box and to the right of that box it reads observed. That box is not marked, indicating it was not observed.
And Dr. Kella, did you review this morning when we received documents from Commission's attorney, did you for the first time review what appeared to be some requirements that are handed out to collectors or ring inspectors that do specimen collections for the Commission?
Yes, briefly.
And did you find a requirement in that document that the collections are to be observed?
I did. I believe I found them on page 15 of the application for inspector.
Okay.
And on there, it clearly says that inspectors will position themselves in a way which will allow them to physically view the fighter urinating into the specimen connector container, no exceptions. So indicating that this is supposed to be done as an observed collection. It was not.
Now, if we could turn back to page 71 of Diaz Exhibit number 2. This time drawing your attention to section D416. Do you see the requirement contained in D416 that the DCO shall test the residual urine in the collection vessel to determine if the sample has a suitable specific gravity for analysis?
Yes.
And again, cross-referencing that with what we see in State 1, page 5, did you form an opinion as to whether that was followed with respect to this collection?
Yes, my opinion is that it was not followed.
And why did you form that opinion?
Well, this is a typical non-regulated form that follows DOT regulations generally. And the collector is prohibited actually from doing any kind of scientific analysis on the sample aside from viewing the sample to ensure that the color is normal or within reason, that smells the sample to ensure that an adulterant wasn't added to it, such as bleach, and then reads a temperature strip that's affixed to the outside of the vessel. Beyond that, they're not supposed to do any kind of scientific analysis on the sample. And on the chain of custody, there is nothing on here that documents that a specific gravity was conducted, and there is nothing written in the remarks section.
Okay. And if we are,
Where were you looking for that?
Oh, sure. On State Exhibit 1, page 5, the chain of custody, there's nothing on there that documents specific gravity. It's not done. It's not normal for it to be on there, is my point. Because this is a non-regulated form, follows DOT's process. And therefore, the collector never performs a specific gravity analysis on a sample.
in contrast, if we are to look at pages 4 and 5 of State Exhibit 2, which are the chain of custody forms that were sent to the Smyrtle lab, Doctor, can you point out where the specific gravity of the residual specimen is detailed on these forms?
Sure. On both page 4 and 5, they are the chain of custody forms that went to the Smyrtle lab. And about maybe a third of the way down from the top, it reads, there's a space that's pre-printed on there. It reads specific gravity on both forms.
And just one more provision I'd like to look at in the WADA guidelines. If you could turn to page 56, please, of Diaz Exhibit 2. And specifically, when you're there, if you could look at section 9.3.3, which provides that documentation identifying the athlete shall not be included with the samples or documentation sent to the laboratory that will be analyzing the samples. Now, cross-referencing that back to page 5 of State Exhibit 1, were you able to form an opinion as to whether
Hey you
this
guys, welcome
was
back to another
followed?
Pothies video. This time it's going to be slightly...
All right, here it is. All right, State Exhibit 1.
Correct.
Yes, I formed an opinion, and it was not followed.
Why did you form that opinion?
Again, this is State Exhibit 1, page 5, the chain of custody for Quest. Step 1D, there's Mr. Nicholas Diaz's name printed right on the form that will accompany the sample to the laboratory, because if you look at all the way at the bottom, it reads copy 1 laboratory.
And again, if we contrast that with the specimen collection forms that we see in State Exhibit 2, which were sent to the Smyrtle lab, we won't find Mr. Diaz's name on these forms, will we?
No, they're not on there.
Now, in your experience, Dr. Kella, as a medical review officer, what is the effect of a flaw such as this that destroys the anonymity of the testing process?
I guess we can refer to Dr. Eckel's comment that it
Dr. Eichner.
Dr. Eichner, that it will create a bias or a possible bias.
Now, also in your expert opinion, Doctor, how important is it to ensure a consistent collection process which thereby ensures a consistency of results?
It's critical to the integrity of a drug testing program. Without having a standard to follow, it introduces many variables. And those variables can ultimately impact the outcome of a result. For example, WADA mandates that a sample is to be conducted as an observed collection. And so that will eliminate issues of adulteration, issues of substitution, issues of bringing someone else's urine in. So it's critical for the integrity of a program to have a particular process that's followed and it's consistent in its process.
What would your believed perception of bias would Quest have of Mr. Diaz?
Well, as Dr. Iker mentioned, the anonymity is critical, as these individuals are well known, and there are some people like them, some people don't, and it's basically to that simplicity. The United States Department of Transportation also prohibits a laboratory from holding a donor's name as well, and again, for the same purposes.
Mr. Middlebrook, do you have further questions of this witness?
I do.
Okay.
Now, speaking of the labs that conducted the tests from Mr. Diaz on January 31st, 2 negatives from the Smyrtle lab and an alleged positive from Quest, showing you what has been marked as Diaz exhibit number 3, I believe now, which is the WADA approved list of laboratories. Did you review this document informing your opinion in this matter?
I did.
And if you could turn to pages 7 and 8, bottom of 7, moving on to the top of page 8. We only see 2 WADA accredited labs in the United States. Do you see that?
I do.
And Quest is not one of them. Would you agree?
Correct.
Yet SMRTL, the lab that analyzed and produced the 2 negative results, is one of the 2 accredited WADA labs.
It is.
Can you explain, in your expert opinion, why differing accreditation of labs could affect the testing process and results?
Sure. For a lab to be accredited, requires that they follow certain protocol and certain standards to ensure that the outcome is similar between different laboratories. They're regulated in terms of what instruments they may use, the reagents on those instruments, the calibration of the instruments, the techniques that are utilized, and those are just very few of the many other requirements that a lab must hold. And without that, the final result can vary dramatically, and as we're seeing in this case.
Okay, speaking of the results, let's look first at the first pre-fight test, which would be contained in State Exhibit 2. And if I could draw your attention first to page 5 of State Exhibit 2, please.
Sure.
And Dr. Keller, are you familiar with this document?
Yes. This is the chain of custody that was conducted on Mr. Nicholas Diaz on January 31st, and it's written on there as pre-fight urine.
And at what time does it indicate this collection was taken?
7:12 p.m.
And does it also indicate who the specimen collector was?
It looks like Mr. Jim Guernsey.
And from your review of the materials, does this form appear to be consistent with forms used to conduct WADA urine testing?
It appears to be.
Now, looking at the label at the bottom of the form, and I believe Mr. Eccles went through this same practice, so we may not have to belabor it, but we see a barcode number bearing the number 281399. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the description of that number is lab ID. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you explain what that would mean?
Sure. It's a lab accession number. So when a sample is collected and is received at the laboratory, they will add to that sample a unique ID number so that they can track it as it goes through the lab and when it's reported out.
Okay, with that in mind and with that 281399 number in mind, can you please now turn to page 17 of this document?
Okay.
Of which?
It would be page 17 of State Exhibit 2. It would be the Smyrtle report.
Okay.
And Dr. Keller, what does this page of the packet represent?
This is the quantitative analysis sample report put forth by Smyrtle, and it's reflecting the sample of urine that was collected from the pre-fight, and we know that because at the top of the form it reads data file 281399.
Okay. And if we move down the form on the left-hand side to where we get to the bolded indication CMP and D, and below that we see THC, what is that telling us?
It stands for, THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol, or its metabolite, and that looks like the compound that was found in that sample of urine.
And if we then move horizontally across the page, all the way to the end to where we have the bolded indication, final CONC, and then we have a number underneath that. Can you tell us what that is?
Sure. That number is the concentration of that metabolite that was found at 49.731 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. And remind us again what the minimum cutoff level is for a positive test under both WADA and commission standards?
150 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. So at 7:12 p.m. on January 31st, 2015, before his fight with Mr. Silva, Mr. Diaz was more than 100 nanograms per milliliter under the positive threshold?
Correct.
So that would be a negative.
That's a negative.
And this specimen was collected from your review following WADA standards and sent to a WADA lab?
Correct.
Let's now look at the first post-fight collection that was taken from Mr. Diaz, and for that we're going to have to go to the Quest pack, which is State Exhibit 1. And if we again look at page 5 of that document, which is the specimen chain of custody form, does it indicate at what time this collection was taken?
At 10:38 p.m.
And was this the same specimen collector that took Mr. Diaz's first pre-fight collection?
No.
And I believe we've already discussed this, but from your review, this does not appear to be a WADA specimen collection form, correct?
No, this is a non-regulated form, typical of a chain of custody form produced by an HHS certified laboratory, as Dr. Sample mentioned.
And in the upper right-hand corner of this chain of custody form, underneath the barcode, we see the number 601155R. Is that similar to the lab ID number we saw on the Smyrtle chain of custody form?
Correct. That's a lab accession number, correct.
And does it serve the same purpose?
Same thing.
Okay. So if we move now to page 52 of this document, we see an indication under the category sample name of 601155R. What is that telling us?
That's telling us that that's reflecting that particular collection.
Okay. And moving down slightly, we see an indication CMP&D like we did on the Smyrtle report. What is that telling us?
That's telling us that there's a marijuana metabolite that was also found in that sample.
Okay. And on this page, page 52 of State Exhibit 1, do we also have a quantitative concentration value of the metabolite?
733.23 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. And that is approximately 688 nanograms per milliliter, higher than Mr. Diaz's pre-fight test of 49.731?
Exactly.
Now, if we turn to page 56, Doctor, of this document, and I believe there was a little
You say
test
56 of this document.
of State Exhibit 1, please. And I believe there was some discussion by Dr. Sample regarding creatinine.
Correct.
If we turn to this page, we see that we have an indication of creatinine and then we have a value. Can you explain how creatinine judges hydration, please?
Sure. Creatinine is a muscle product waste. When muscles function, they generate creatinine. It's excreted by the kidneys, and it's excreted on a regular basis, on a constant basis, and there's minimal fluctuation in a normal, healthy individual, and it's not really impacted by age or sex by much. So it's a nice constant, and in turn, having that constant, you're better able to assess the fluid concentration that that constant may be in. So for example, if it's in a very small amount of fluid, that value is going to be elevated because it's concentrated. If it's in a large amount of fluid, in large urine, or the urine is dilute, that concentration of creatinine drops. So that's how you can assess creatinine and the degree of hydration or dehydration, because it is a constant that's constantly generated by the body and excreted effectively and efficiently by the kidneys.
Quest, however, did not use specific gravity like we saw with the water collection.
No, they used, they did not use specific gravity. They used creatinine.
And at what point would a non-water lab such as Quest utilize specific gravity?
Just exactly as Dr. Sample mentioned, if the sample is found to be very dilute, meaning that the creatinine is at 20 milligrams, or in fact, it's below 20 milligrams or equal to 20 milligrams per deciliter, it then triggers the use of a specific gravity to further analyze it.
And can you explain to the Commission what specific gravity measures and how that is different from creatinine?
Sure. They both measure hydration. Specific gravity is looking at the density of fluid. So, and they use a reference, as Dr. Iker mentioned, and that's basically 1.000. So if something is very dilute, it will be very close to that value. As the urine or whatever fluid you're looking at is becoming more concentrated, it becomes denser, and in turn the value is higher than 1.000. Now, the key element here is it becomes difficult to compare the two. You cannot determine what creatinine is if I was to give someone just a specific gravity, and vice versa. You can't figure out what the specific gravity is by being given creatinine alone.
So they're not interchangeable?
They're not interchangeable.
Now, if we do look at Mr. Diaz's creatinine value that we see on page 56 of State Exhibit 1 of 168.4 milligrams per deciliter, what does that tell you about his hydration level at 10:38 p.m.
Sure.
When this specimen
He's either, and again, Dr. Sample clearly mentioned this, he's either euhydrated or dehydrated, slightly dehydrated, but he's certainly not overly hydrated because the creatinine is not close to 20.
So in layman's terms, he's either normal or slightly dehydrated.
Correct.
Okay, let's look at that last post-fight collection, and for that we have to go back to State Exhibit 2, and specifically if I could draw your attention to page 4 of State Exhibit 2. And does this page 4 indicate at what time this collection was taken?
This was collected at 11:55 p.m.
And it would appear that this test was consistent in terms of form used, collector, and process as was the first pre-fight test?
It does.
And again, moving to the lab ID number on the bottom of the form, 281396, do you see that?
I do.
Okay, so with that 281396 in mind, let's take a look at page 16 of State Exhibit 2. And Doctor, what does page 16 of State Exhibit 2 represent?
This is a quantitative analysis sample report for the collection that was conducted at 11:55 p.m. And we know that because, again, the top reads 281396.
Okay, and if we move down like we did on the prior page to where it says CMPND and then THC, is that showing us the same as it did on page 17?
It does. And it's marijuana, THC marijuana metabolite also found in that sample.
Okay, and if we again move all the way to the right where it bears final CONC and a number, what is that telling us?
It's telling you that that there's a concentration of 61.104 nanograms per milliliter of the marijuana metabolite that was found in that sample.
Okay. So just briefly, we see here that it's 61.104 nanograms per milliliter. That's roughly 11 nanograms per milliliter higher than Mr. Diaz's pre-fight Smyrtle result of 49.731. What would you attribute that small swing in result to?
That's a typical movement that you would expect to see in a more concentrated sample or more dehydrated sample.
And with the number 61.104 is still below the WADA and commission confirmation cutoff level of 150?
Yes.
So it's a negative.
It's still a negative. Yeah.
So 1 hour, 17 minutes following the Quest specimen that produced a result of 733.23. We now have a result of 61.104, which would represent an approximate decrease of 672 nanograms per milliliter in just an hour and 17 minutes. Is that right?
Correct.
And you have heard, or you've been sitting here and you're aware of the allegation that the swing from 733 down to 61 could be attributed to Mr. Diaz's ability to rehydrate following his first post-fight Quest collection before his second post-fight Smurtle collection. Have you heard that?
I have.
And in your expert medical opinion, is a swing that large in marijuana metabolites in that time period medically plausible based on rehydration?
No, absolutely not. And here's the reason. If to drop the concentration from 733 to 61 in an hour and 17 minutes would require massive consumption of fluid. We're talking on the orders of several liters in a very short period of time. That has an effect on the body, and it causes what we would define as hyponatremia. The sodium level in our system drops precipitously, and that's, or an electrolyte imbalance. Basically, it can, if not properly corrected, can lead to serious medical conditions such as severe headaches, nausea, vomiting, confusion, and what's happening is there's a shift of fluid from outside of the cells into the cells, so the cells start to swell. Inside the brain, as the cells are starting to enlarge, there's disruption of electrical activity, so a seizure can ensue. If you don't actively intervene, a coma ensues, and ultimately, as the brain continues to swell, the brainstem will herniate. Person dies. So it's a very serious condition to get to and needs to be promptly corrected. So it's not medically plausible that the individual could have consumed, we're talking about on the order of 30 glasses of water, you know, just an exquisite amount of fluid to actively bring that value from 723 or 33 nanograms per milliliter down to 61 in such a short period of time.
Now,
Are you suggesting then that the Quest results are incorrect?
I'm suggesting that it is a scientific analysis. We've got two laboratories that are producing very different results. And the explanation of if this is from hydration alone, it's not medically plausible.
And have you had an opportunity, Dr. Kella, to review Mr. Diaz's post-fight press conference following his fight on January 31st, 2015?
I looked at it.
And in that press conference, did Mr. Diaz appear to be symptomatic of water intoxication?
He appeared to be coherent.
And from a factual standpoint, if we look at pages 4 and 5 of State's Exhibit 2, do you have that? What do pages 4 and 5, focusing on the specific gravity levels, tell you about Mr. Diaz's hydration level at the time of the 11:55 p.m. collection?
Sure. It's telling you that there's been the specific gravity was 1.002 pre-fight. Post-fight is 1.009. So this individual is more, the specific gravity is higher, suggesting a more concentrated fluid in comparison to the pre-fight, and clearly attributed if someone is exercising and sweating and you're losing fluids, in addition to the, what we define as insensible fluid loss. You're also losing fluid in that respect.
Thank you. And if we could look just briefly at pages 18 and 19 of State's Exhibit 2, please, which are the confidential test reports from Smurtle. And in the right-hand side of the first set of data that's produced, on the very bottom, we see an an indication that says LH, and then we
Correct.
see some numerical values. Does that also support your analysis on hydration?
It does. LH stands for luteinizing hormone, and it's the pre-fight is coming in at 1.8 milli-international units per milliliter. Post-fight, it's 10 times higher. It's more concentrated at 18.4 milli-international units per milliliter.
And by more concentrated, you mean less water, still dehydrated?
Correct.
Okay, so not only would the hydration needed to swing the number from 733 to 61 in less than an hour and 20 minutes be medically implausible. As we see, Mr. Diaz still had not returned to his pre-fight hydration levels when the 11:55 p.m. collection was taken.
Correct.
So there is no factual or medical support for the 733 to 61 reduction by overconsumption of fluids in that time period?
Correct.
So in conclusion, Dr. Kella, looking at the three tests and the marijuana metabolite levels of 49 at 7:12 p.m., which followed WADA procedures and went to a WADA lab, 733 nanograms at 10:38 p.m., not following WADA procedures and sent to a non-WADA lab, and finally 61 at 11:55 p.m. following WADA procedures, again from a WADA lab. In your expert opinion, can we rely on the 733 value produced by the Quest specimen?
No.
And as a medical doctor and medical review officer with over 20 years of experience, what is your opinion of that Quest analysis which resulted in the 733 reading?
As a physician and a medical review officer, just as you said, I've been doing this for over 20 years. Had these results come in front of my desk, I would have had to prefer the findings put forth by Smurtle. The sample, Smurtle presented two independent separate values, both reported out by the laboratory as negative. They're both under the commission's cutoff values of 150, and not accept the outlier of what was produced by Quest.
And have you had the opportunity to review the commission's hearing last month with Mr. Silva?
Yes.
And did you hear the statement made by Commissioner Lundvall that, quote, Quest does a rudimentary type of testing and it is less refined than that of Smurtle, end quote?
Yes.
And does that statement made by Commissioner Lundvall, is that consistent with your conclusion in this matter?
Quest is a very capable laboratory, but in this particular case, I would have to favor what Smurtle is reporting and recommend that the test, as a medical review officer, and that's the job of a medical review officer, is to analyze test results and make a recommendation, is to tell you that this should be treated as a negative test.
Subject to redirect, no further questions.
I've got a few questions of Dr. Keller, please. Dr. Keller, if I understand your testimony, your quarrel with the collection procedure appears to be on 4 points or 4 issues. Number one is that you contend that the collector sealed the sample that was taken by a Quest and not the athlete. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so in this particular circumstance, it's the collector that actually did the sealing of the sample that was given by the athlete.
Correct.
And the second issue then that you have quarrel with is that the collection was not observed by our inspectors,
Correct.
but it was the collector who was actually doing the inspection in this particular instance. Is that correct?
The collector is the one that's performing the collection.
Do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Diaz had offered a false sample, that Mr. Diaz had alterated his sample, that he was giving urine from someplace else other than his body sample?
I can only go by what's in front of me. So what's in front of me is it was not done as an observed collection. Beyond that, I'm not.
All right.
I have no comment on it.
Okay, and so the collection, though, from the perspective, as you understand it, was observed by the collector, but it may not have been observed by the inspector for the athletic commission because the box was not checked on the particular form.
That's correct.
All right. And then if I understand your testimony, you've got some issue regarding the specific gravity testing?
I don't have a particular issue with anything. I'm just stating the facts.
Well, do you quarrel with the collection process because of some issue regarding the specific gravity
I
test?
think you misunderstood what I was saying.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
Sure. What I said was, the collection that was conducted that went to Quest Diagnostics was following the standards that were, that Quest Diagnostics in the non-regulated and regulated arena follow. And that is, the collector is not to analyze a sample aside from the 3 things they're supposed to do. Unlike the Smyrtle collection process that obligates the collector to analyze a sample.
And so, from the Quest perspective, though, the specific gravity was not analyzed by the collector, but was analyzed by someone else.
No, there was no specific gravity analyzed on this Quest sample.
All right, so back to my question. Do you have any information or evidence that has been supplied to you that Mr. Diaz had somehow offered a sample other than his own, that he had alterated the sample that he'd given, anything of that nature?
No.
All right. And then the last issue you have concerning the collection process then was that the identification of the athlete was given on the actual sample that was tested then by Quest. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Rather than some type of an identifying number that obliterated then the identification of
That
the
maintains the anonymity of the individual, correct.
All right. Were you asked to provide any advice then to counsel for Mr. Diaz as to the advisability of doing the sampling or doing testing of the B sample?
No, because there was no need.
No. Well, my question to you is, were you asked your opinion as to whether or not that the B sample should be tested or not?
At what point? Are you asking me when I was asked?
Well, what I'm asking you is, had counsel or anyone on behalf of Mr. Diaz then asked you whether or not that there should be a testing of the B sample?
Yes.
And what was your response to that?
Most recently, I said that there was no need for a B sample to be tested because you have on the same day something even better than the B sample. You've got 2 other samples that were tested that are coming in consistent. The whole concept of a B sample testing is what? Is to say, if you don't believe what this laboratory is telling you, send it to a different laboratory and have them analyze that sample. And they'll tell you exactly what's happening. And this is exactly what happened. There's no point in having a B sample tested.
And
when
is
you're
that your understanding of what the B sample testing is about?
Commissioner, I would appreciate if you would let him finish his answer before interrupting, please.
Is that your understanding of what the testing of the B sample
The
is about,
testing
that
of-
it goes to an independent or a different laboratory than had done the original test?
That's correct. Exactly.
And that is why that you didn't suggest then that the B sample be tested?
B sample, the purpose of the B sample is to analyze, is to say, is the first laboratory reporting accurately the information that you're looking at? And therefore, you have a second independent laboratory that analyzes that sample. You already have it. You already have a different laboratory analyzing the sample before and after that's giving you consistent results. So on a practical basis, you've got your information.
And that's your understanding of the B sample testing then that is conducted by the Athletic Commission?
We keep going around in circles. My answer is the B sample is to test and to confirm what the first laboratory is finding.
And what I'm trying to do is to understand and to get you to confirm that what you've testified to is your understanding of how the Nevada Athletic Commission handles testing of B samples.
I can't comment on the Nevada Athletic Commission. I can comment on what is the standard in the industry for the testing of the sample.
Thank you. When you talk about water intoxication, you had indicated that one would have to consume many liters of fluid.
Correct.
How many liters of fluid?
It's variable. It depends on the age of the individual, the weight of the individual, on the sex of the individual. There are many variables that play a role. But my point trying to tell you is that, so I'm not going to give you an exact number to walk away with. But what I'm trying to communicate to you is that it would take liters of fluid to be able to dilute down the sample from 733 nanograms per milliliter down to 61 in a period of an hour and 17 minutes. It's just not medically plausible to be able to do that and still be coherent.
All right, let's take the variables that you just identified. Use the statistics then for Mr. Diaz. I think from his application, he's 6'1", weighs about 200 pounds. I think he fought at 196, 197. We can determine what his age is, and we know that he's male. Given those variables then, and those markers on those variables, can you approximate how many liters then that Mr. Diaz would have to consume for which to exhibit then water intoxication?
What I'm trying to tell you is that it would require volumes of fluid. Can I give you an exact value? No, I'm not. I would be incorrect, and I would be at fault for being incorrect. So I'm not going to do that. So, but I'm just trying to communicate to you that it would require volumes of fluid to actively bring down a value from 733 down to 61 in a period of an hour and 15 minutes. So if you're trying to pin me down and say, well, tell me exactly here are the base, I'm not going to, I can't provide you that.
Can you give me a range?
Liters, I already did. I said it would take volumes of fluid to be able to do so.
And when you say liters, are we talking about 2? Are we talking about 10? Are we talking about 100? Can you give any range? And if the answer is no, then just let me know that.
I believe I already said I cannot give you an exact value. I mean, you keep pushing me for the same thing. I keep very politely trying to tell you. As a physician, I will not hand over information that's inaccurate. And since I do not know, I can't give you an exact value. You try to pin me to say, well, give me a number. I can't do that.
Now, last set of questions then for you, Dr. Keller. Were you provided with information from Mr. Diaz as to his attempts to provide us with a sample, in a clean sample or a clean test that would have allowed him to obtain a license from us pre-fight?
No.
So you didn't look at any of those?
I have no knowledge of any.
And you don't have any information concerning his efforts by which to obtain a clean test?
No.
Thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners?
No, sir.
No, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Eccles? Sure.
So, Dr. Kella, as a medical review officer, do you submit blind quality control specimens to labs such as Quest?
No.
You've never submitted a quality
It's usually left to the third-party administrator to do, not as a medical review officer to submit blind samples to.
Are you aware then of any of your customers for which you provide MRO services, providing any blind quality control specimens to Quest?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is there any approximation you can give me as to how many blind quality control specimens for drugs of abuse, including the cannabinoids or THC, that would be submitted, say, on a monthly basis?
I honestly couldn't give you an exact figure. I don't know. But we definitely review clients that submit blind samples. We review them, and they come through as blind samples going to Quest.
Can you give me an example of one of your larger volume clients?
Sure. Lowe's Home Improvement.
Okay, and so is it your understanding that Lowe's submits those blind quality control specimens
Yes.
to Quest?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any approximation of how many Lowe's would submit on a monthly basis?
If I knew, I'd be happy to tell you. I honestly don't know.
Have you ever heard of Quest being wrong on a cannabinoid result?
Have I ever
on
heard
a
of one?
blind quality control test?
No.
Okay. Now, my understanding of your role as an MRO is that if a positive result or abnormal result is reported by the lab to you, then part of the scope of your duties would be to interview the donor of the specimen. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, in this case, did you interview Nick Diaz?
No.
So you didn't ask him about his marijuana use?
No, and in fact, I was kind of surprised that the state commission does not utilize a medical review officer in this process. It was quite shocking, really. And in fact, when you asked Dr. Sample, was a bottle B sent? He said, no, he has no knowledge of it. And that's typically because the opportunity arises when the laboratory reports a result to a medical review officer, who then reaches out to the individual to inquire to see, do you have a legitimate medical explanation why this test is coming up positive as it is? And typically the MRO's name is printed on the chain of custody in the right upper corner of the form. And that's where the laboratory will release the result to. And as I understand it, Mr. Diaz was never contacted by a medical review officer to inquire to see if there was a legitimate medical explanation why his test came up positive, or to offer him an opportunity to have the sample be tested.
Would it surprise you to know that as soon as the result was reported by Quest to the commission, that I sent a letter to him advising him that there was a positive test and that if he wished to have the B specimen tested, he should immediately notify me or have his representative do so?
So you're acting as the MRO?
Also, it assumes facts, not evidence.
I don't know.
No, it's part of the complaint that was sent to Mr. Diaz. Attached to every complaint, which is part of the record, there's a letter I send to him saying, if you wish to have your B specimen tested, please immediately notify me, or you can have your representative contact me. Now, isn't it true that the standard in your industry would be for the person who would come back positive or abnormal on an A would be to then have the B specimen tested?
Can you repeat your question?
Is it true that if a specimen is reported positive or abnormal,
yes,
that the normal course, if the person was contesting that result, would then to request the B specimen be tested?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's because the reason the B sample came about was because in situations exactly like this, where the individual goes, whoa, I didn't take any drugs, I didn't do anything, I'm clean, the lab made a mistake. And so there's no way of going back in time.
I object. I don't understand the answer. I think it's non-responsive.
I said yes.
Saying, okay.
So what I was trying to say is the bottle B came about to permit the opportunity to kind of go back in time. Because if you wait long enough, eventually it's going to clear out of the system. And therefore, if the guy goes and gives another sample following several days later, it's going to be negative. And then you have a positive test and you have a negative test and you don't know what to do with it. So bottle B, the concept of bottle B came about to go, okay, collect the sample initially, separate them out. If the guy contests, have that sample sent to another lab to give fairness to the process and accuracy. Well, in this case, he already had bottle B done in essence because an hour before and a couple hours later, the sample was tested and tested at a different lab.
So my question is, if a person comes back positive on an A, are you saying that it's mandatory under any rules that if they want to test the B, it has to go to a different lab?
What I'm saying is if bottle A tests positive and the individual wishes to contest it and bottle B is available, it is afforded to the individual within a 72-hour time period by DOT is to have that sample sent to a different laboratory to confirm for whatever substance he wishes to contest.
Right, and if the individual is not contesting the results, they're not asking for the B to be tested, then isn't it correct that you would stand by the results of the A bottle?
Yes.
Okay, and here, obviously that was a positive, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, you didn't interview Nick Diaz, but let's say, maybe I'll get in trouble for a hypothetical. Let's say you had, let's say he said, I've used marijuana. am I correct that his use of marijuana is still not a valid alternative explanation as to why he tested positive on the Quest result?
So you're asking me, his use of marijuana is not a valid reason?
Yes, is it a valid reason? If you're the MRO and you have a positive result, as we do in this case, in the A bottle for marijuana, and you interview the person and they say, I used marijuana, does that mean that you can then report to the employer that the person has a valid medical explanation for testing positive for marijuana?
Objection vague as to valid, depending on which regulations and in which jurisdictions, especially with a number of jurisdictions legalizing medicinal marijuana, we need to be clear as to what standards we're asking the doctor about.
Well, let me ask you, let's say you're looking at a result. If a person ever says, I use marijuana, does that enable you to tell the employer ever that, yes, now it's fine, it's not positive because they have a valid medical explanation?
In certain states, in fact, certain states require that if you get a positive test for marijuana, you have to confirm that they hold a medical marijuana card, and upon doing so, depending on the employer, if it's not regulated, because regulated there is no excuse for marijuana. In non-regulated world, so for example Lowe's, let's strike that. I shouldn't say someone. Okay, I'm gonna move on because I should not have said the company's name.
Okay. Let me see. You testified that you had been certified to testify as an expert in one court in New York, is that right?
Yes.
And that was a number of years ago?
Yes.
Do you know approximately which year?
No.
Okay.
This is years ago.
I mean, you testified that the topic area related to the interpretation of a drug test, is that right?
Correct.
And do you recall, was that a single drug test that you were testifying to?
Oh, years ago?
Yes. In that case?
In that case. It's possible. This is years ago. I do not honestly clearly recall.
Is this the first time you've formed an opinion based upon 3 results given in one day?
Yes.
If let's say for the federal form you discussed, it's important, I think counsel used the word, it would destroy the anonymity. Let's say you get a form, federal form, and it has the name of the donor of the specimen. Does that mean as an MRO that you are just to totally disregard that and throw it away?
No.
Okay, so it's not a fatal flaw.
It's absolutely not a fatal flaw.
Okay. Now, just about hydration for a minute. You would agree with me in a general sense that a person's hydration affects the results of a test. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And would it surprise you to know that Mr. Diaz has had trouble urinating in the past when he's been directed to do so by a commission employee?
I'm not aware.
Okay. Would it surprise you that in 2011 he delayed urinating for hours and finally urinated at about 2 a.m. and that Quest reported his specimen as dilute?
I'm not aware. Would
it surprise you that he was actually conscious and not suffering from any kind of physical or medical problem that would make him unable to act like a normal person, even though he had consumed a lot of water for that night?
Can't comment.
Okay.
I'm going to object to this whole line of questioning in that it appears to be counsel testifying without any documents, without any evidence, without any witness. He's going into things in the past that he's asserting as fact.
Oh, it is fact. I have actually the order from 2012, which is a public record, which has it in the findings of fact, and I can hand that out to everybody if you want. It's a public record.
However, questions are not evidence answers are evidence.
Well, when they're
And so
narratives,
they're-
they are
Hold on,
evidence.
don't interrupt me either.
This man has due process
Hold on,
rights, and
I
I know you're not a
I
court of
understand
law,
that.
but you should honor that to some extent.
I understand that, but the questions are not evidence, the answers are evidence. And so therefore, if you're placing an objection to the question, I would recommend to the chair that your objection be overruled.
Final question. The first February 4, 2012 contest, when the executive director told the ring inspector to leave without Diaz getting his check for the night if he did not urinate before midnight, would it surprise you that Diaz finally urinated at 11:59 p.m.? Would it surprise you that all that was an attempt to overly hydrate so that the results would be dilute and therefore he would be negative? I need an audible answer for the.
I have no comment.
Okay, thank you. I don't have further questions.
I have a few on redirect.
Sure.
Mr. Eccles asked you if it was standard in your industry that if an individual was a verified positive, that they would have their B specimen tested. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Is it standard in your industry to see 3 specimen collections taken from the same individual in a matter of 4 hours?
This is the first time I see it.
And just to clarify for purposes of the record, the letter that Mr. Eccles was alluding to is not attached to the complaint as an exhibit. Now, he asked you about the court that you testified in New York.
Was there an answer to the question? Or is counsel making a statement?
Would you mind taking a look at the complaint for disciplinary action against Mr. Diaz, Doctor? And as you thumb through the exhibits, do you see a letter addressed to Mr. Diaz advising him of his positive test results?
No, I do not.
Mr. Eccles asked you about some of your expert testimony. Have you also provided expert testimony in front of the National Labor Relations Board?
I have.
And is that a federal administrative body?
It is.
And in those proceedings in front of the National Labor Relations Board, how many times have you testified in front of the NLRB?
Once.
And what was the subject matter of that testimony?
It was interpretation of a drug test result.
And have you also testified in front of an administrative law judge pursuant to a Federal Aviation Administration action to remove a pilot from his license to fly commercial aircraft?
I have.
And in that proceeding, what was the subject matter of the testimony?
It's a collection procedural error.
And you were asked a few questions by Commissioner Lundvall regarding water intoxication and how many liters someone would have had to drink. Putting that aside, if someone had consumed enough fluid to drop that value from 733 to 61, would their specific gravity in that specimen also have dropped closer to the 1 value?
Correct.
No further questions.
Just a quick follow-up, Dr. Kella.
Sure.
You had indicated that you testified before the NLRB once?
Correct.
And once before an administrative law judge?
Several times in front of an administrative law judge.
And on how many occasions before the administrative law judge?
About 7 to 8 different times.
All right. And in front of the NLRB board, who had retained you?
It was counsel for a client of mine.
And was that, have you had any prior association then with Mr. Middlebrook or representatives of his firm?
Yes.
And on how many occasions?
On once.
Okay. And what was that one occasion?
For the FAA issue.
Thank you. I have no further questions of this witness.
I don't have further questions. Just for the record, I would point out on page 6, there's a complaint or attached to the complaint for discipline. You'll see a certificate of service. That includes a document on the next page called a notice of complaint, an obligation to answer complaint. And it's on that page that you can see all these documents were mailed at one time together to the respondent. And the last sentence of that is, should you have any questions regarding this process or wish to discuss the testing of your B specimen, please immediately contact me at the below number. And that's dated February 6, 2015, when all these documents would have gone out. So if I misspoke and said it was an exhibit, I'm wrong, but it all went out as part of the packet to the respondent on that date. I don't have questions of the witness.
Thank you. Are we done with the witness?
Well, and the defense rests, subject to any sir rebuttal.
We got a few questions of Mr. Diaz, please. Mr. Diaz, would you state your name for the record, please?
It's Nick Diaz.
It's my understanding that you are a UFC fighter, is that correct?
Yeah.
And you fought in the UFC, I think it was what, 184, 183?
Respectfully, I'm not going to answer the question.
And the reason why?
Fifth Amendment.
And do you have reasonable cause to believe that you are going to be subject to criminal prosecution?
Same answer.
Fifth Amendment.
Okay. And has there been any announcement of any criminal prosecution against you?
Same answer.
Fifth Amendment.
Do you consider yourself to be an unarmed combatant?
Same.
Fifth Amendment.
When did you first learn that you were going to fight in UFC? I think, like I said, I think it's 183. It was the fight that was on January 31st of 2015.
Fifth Amendment.
It's my understanding that based upon announced reports that you would have learned at least by July 30th of 2014. Is that correct?
Fifth Amendment.
Now, you were aware that if you were going to fight in the state of Nevada, that you would have had to provide a clean test upon reapplication before the State Athletic Commission, correct?
Fifth Amendment.
And what did you understand that clean test to require?
Fifth Amendment.
What efforts did you take to determine if, in fact, that you could produce a clean test?
The Fifth Amendment.
And did you understand a clean test to require you to be under the acceptable levels for marijuana testing?
The Fifth Amendment.
As well as every other prohibited substance, both in competition as well as out of competition.
Fifth Amendment.
Now, did you have difficulty producing a clean test?
Fifth Amendment.
Did you go to the a laboratory and provide a urine sample and ask to see the results of that urine sample?
Fifth Amendment.
And did you have to do that excuse me?
Mr. Chair, if I may make an objection, a standing objection. It's abuse of discretion. Mr. Diaz is going to answer the same question, the same answer to every question. The only purpose for this exercise is to create a spectacle to embarrass him and to undermine his exercise of constitutional rights. And we want to put the commission on notice that that's our view.
We appreciate that very much. One of the things that I'm trying to do is to make the appropriate record that in this civil proceeding, which we're in, is a civil proceeding, that we may infer a negative or an adverse response to the question that in fact that is given in response to a question for which the Fifth Amendment is asserted. So I'm going to continue as far as to make the record here, please. Mr. Diaz?
Well, respectfully, we disagree with your interpretation of the laws, and albeit you may be governed by your commission's regulations, I believe the United States Constitution and the Nevada State Constitution trump those regulations. But proceed with your misinterpretation of the law.
know, at some point in time, somebody's gonna tell us if you're right or I'm right, so.
I believe so.
I agree with you, so I'm just gonna go ahead and continue to make the record, all right?
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Diaz, back to my questions to you. Did you take any efforts then to determine if in fact that you could provide a clean test upon reapplication before the State Athletic Commission?
Fifth Amendment.
Did you wait to submit an application until January 28th, which was only 3 days before your fight, because you had difficulties providing a clean test to go along with the application that you intended to submit to us?
Fifth Amendment.
Between your license date of January 28th of 2015 and your fight night on January 31st, did you consume marijuana?
Fifth Amendment.
You had a physical on the night of the weigh-in, did you not?
Fifth Amendment.
One of the ringside doctors performed a physical examination of you as well as you filling out a pre-fight medical questionnaire, is that correct?
Fifth Amendment.
Did you read that pre-fight medical questionnaire?
Fifth Amendment.
Do you read English?
Fifth Amendment.
Do you understand English?
Fifth Amendment.
And you understood the question that was posed on the pre-fight medical questionnaire. Have you taken or received any medication, drug, cream, inhalant, or injection, whether prescription, over the counter, from anyone or any place in the last month? Your response was no. Was that a true statement?
Fifth Amendment.
Was that a false statement?
Fifth Amendment.
Were you intending to provide false information to this commission?
Fifth Amendment.
Within 30 days prior to your fight on January 31st of 2015, had you consumed marijuana?
Fifth Amendment.
On the day of your fight on January 31st, 2015, did you consume marijuana?
Fifth Amendment.
One last question for you, Mr. Diaz. Back in August 15th of 2009, you were scheduled to fight in the state of California, and your opponent was Jay Huron. And you failed to obtain a license from the California State Athletic Commission because you did not attend the pre-fight drug testing. Did you not attend that pre-fight drug testing because you knew you were going to fail?
Fifth Amendment.
I have no further questions.
Any other questions of commissioners?
No, sir.
She covered it. Mr. Eccles, any questions?
No.
Or is there any more evidence or witnesses that either counsel would like to present?
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to call Aldo Galvan briefly.
Mr. Middlebrook, do you object?
I don't object.
Can you establish a basis for Mr. Aldo's testimony?
Testimony relates to counsel saying that the specimen, or perhaps there being an inference that the specimen was not observed.
Thank you. Mr. Aldo, can you please come forward? We're going to swear you in quickly. You don't have to sit over there. You can sit over here if you want. Aldo, we're going to swear you in with the Attorney General if you don't mind.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And you know that carries these same penalties of good court.
Proceed.
Yes, I'm going to do this very briefly. Mr. Galvan, tell us your first name and your last name, and spell your last name.
First name Aldo, last name Galvan, Galvan.
And can you tell us what, if any, role you have with the commission and regulation of unarmed combat in Nevada?
Basically what I do, I'm an inspector, licensed in 2012, and my role is to inspect all fighters, and we also initiate drug testing.
On the night of January 31st, am I correct that you were the ring inspector that was assigned to perform the drug testing collection function of Mr. Diaz?
That's correct.
Okay. And before I get to the very specific questions about that. Can you tell the commission what, if anything, you did before you became a licensed ring inspector, as far as training for that job?
Training for that, I trained for about 1 year prior to that. That was in 2011, and also worked for the school district, psychological services. Worked for the school district psychological services, and boxing has been a passion of mine forever. So in 2011, I got the opportunity to train with the commission.
Okay. And so you've been performing that function as a licensed ringside inspector since 2012, am I correct?
2012, yes.
Okay. Now, on the January 31st contest, you were assigned to Mr. Diaz, is that right?
Yes.
And what I want to know about is, can you describe the process of taking a specimen from him, please?
Yes. Basically, what we do is we don't know which fighter we're going to get until that evening. Once we're assigned that fighter, we need to know what time they come in, and then we try to get a generalization of what time the fight will be over. That way, we can initiate drug testing. Either it's pre-test or post-test. That night, I had a post-test with Smyrtle. And what we do is, if we collaborate with Smyrtle, then what Smyrtle does is they use their cup, and then with our samples, they're all sealed, and we have the fighter actually open the sample. In that cup, there's 2 tubes, which we split. Smyrtle then takes the urine, and then we grab whatever we need, which is 15 milliliters, and we split in half. If they don't have enough, then they'll throw their specimen away and they'll start all over again. So what we do is we seal the tubes up right in front of the fighter. There's a 2 SKUs that they have numbers on them. The fighter initials them, and we fill out proper paperwork. The fighter initials the SKU numbers. We attach them on top of the tubes, and right in front of the fighter, we actually put them in the bags and seal it up.
Specifically, I want to know the details when you collected from Mr. Diaz.
Okay. Details I do remember, I had my chief inspector behind me. We also had a trainee that was training for the evening. Smyrtle we were in the restroom. It took a while. It did take a while to drug test. We know that some fighters are really dehydrated after the fight. Some fighters can go right away. Some fighters do struggle with the urine testing. At that point, we knew that Diaz was struggling a little bit, so we took our time. As soon as he was able to go, Smyrtle and I did see him take his test, urinate inside Smyrtle's cup, and then at that point, we just split him there.
So I want to know, with respect to observing the specimen, did you watch him urinate into the cup?
Yes.
Okay. Now there's a box on the form. It wasn't checked.
Right.
If you had to go back and check that, or if you had to go back and fill that out, would it be the correct thing to do to check that box?
As of now, yes, because I do see it, but we do have the fighters always watch what we do, because towards the end of the test, we actually give a kind of like a receipt, we hand them the receipt that we initiated the test, and also we have the fighters look when we seal the bag up.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the specimen that was collected came from Nick Diaz because you observed him urinate into the cup?
There's no doubt.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Mr. Galvan. My name's Lucas Middlebrook. I'm an attorney for Nick Diaz.
Yes.
Just ask you a few questions. If you don't understand, please ask me to rephrase. You mentioned Smyrtle, but you sent the specimen to Quest, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And when you said that you opened up who opened the specimen container? Was it you?
The fighter does.
The fighter. And when they open it up and the 2 vials come out,
Yes.
am I correct that those 2 vials are each total 30 milliliters? There's two lines indicating 15 milliliters and 30 milliliters on each bottle, correct?
Yes.
And the first one, you would pour a minimum of 30 into the A specimen?
The first one is, well, the cup is, yeah, it's 30. We try to get 30
Right.
in there. There's 2 vials, the 2 cups that we have for Quest, we split them into 2, 15 and 15.
15 and 15?
Yes.
So you don't put 30 in the one in the A specimen?
No.
Okay. And are you familiar with the WADA collection guidelines, which require 30 and 60 in the vials?
I'm not.
No, okay. And do you have any documents detailing any training that you received with respect to specimen collection of urine samples?
We do have training. We have I am involved in a little committee that we started with the commission. What it is for the inspectors who come in, and we do a train. We actually have a training manual that we have the inspectors, new inspectors come in, and we train from drug testing to hand wraps, everything that we do throughout the evening.
Okay, let's talk specifically about the drug testing training.
Yes.
Who is training the individuals?
The chief inspector.
Chief inspector. And do you know who he's been certified by to be a urine specimen collector?
No.
And do you have a certificate or anything indicating that you've received training on how to properly collect a urine specimen collection?
No.
No further questions.
Any questions from the commissioner?
No.
Thank you, Aldo. If there are no other witnesses and there are no other comments from the parties, we will move into the deliberation. Would you like to make closing arguments at this time?
I have no further comments.
Mr. Eccles?
Yes, very briefly, they amended their answer right before the hearing started. It's paragraph number 9 on page 2 of the amended answer. I think you can see that they changed their answer from deny to admitting the inaccuracy of the information on the pre-fight medical questionnaire. I just want to point that out. The other thing is I don't have to prove willful intent to provide false testimony on the questionnaire. Intent is not a requirement, so I think that they're changing their answer is basically, partly an admission of inaccurate information on the pre-fight medical questionnaire, which is a violation of the statute and regulations. Yes, briefly I just comment on the testimony of the experts. In our view, it's a well-known secret that drug testing works better for some drugs than it does for others, but hydration greatly impacts the result of a test. There are many other factors, but hydration is one of them. You've heard testimony from my 2 experts. They're both toxicologists, and they've testified that they stand by their results essentially, okay? The normal course would have been to test a B. The normal course would have been to do something else if you're challenging the result. They didn't do that, and therefore the result of the A stands. I think as far as commissioners evaluating it, it may be helpful if you evaluate the credibility of Dr. Kella in the sense that he's not a toxicologist, and in the sense that what you heard was really, well, there's 3 tests this night, and one of them seems to be an outlier, so that one must be wrong. Well, that's his first time coming up with this methodology. That's what he testified to, that this is the first time he's examined 3 results like this. That's not a scientifically reliable method by which to say that the Quest result is wrong or that the Smyrtle result is wrong. They're all valid, okay? It is affected by hydration, okay? He came back positive. It's a violation of your rules, and essentially that's the major part of the story, other than he didn't request the B testing, which would have been the normal thing to do if he had a problem with it. The only other thing in closing is the citation to your regulation is 467942 sub 3. That's the regulation that relates to a person invoking their privilege against self-incrimination. And the language of that, I guess we'll get to court on it later, but it must be properly invoked. We're in an administrative setting. They haven't shown that there was any threat of a criminal suit, and so that will probably hinge on that sort of language. But again, their answer was changed at the last minute to essentially admit that there was false information on the pre-fight medical questionnaire, and that in and of itself is a basis to find a violation. So I'd submit it to you based upon that. Thank you.
I would like, if possible, to respond and hit a few points 15 of the Commission's complaint, which in my review is the sole allegation calling for discipline outside of the factual allegations. And that's limited to by his administration or use of a prohibited substance. Diaz has violated NAC 467.850 and 467.886. Commission is bound by its pleadings, and I believe we've presented more than enough evidence to show that this gentleman, Mr. Diaz, was tested 3 times in a matter of 4 hours, and you had 2 tests that were significantly below the applicable cutoff levels. And you had 1 test that was out in left field. It was 733 nanograms per milliliter. And the Commission wants to rest its entire defense, for lack of better terminology, this shoddy testing process, this employing of different methods from the same individual, which resulted in different results, to he overhydrated. We have a medical doctor who said in order to do that much fluid, he would have been suffering from water intoxication. But putting the theory aside, just looking at the specific gravity levels from his pre-fight test and his 11:55 p.m. collection, he didn't overhydrate. He still had not returned to his pre-fight hydration levels. Add the luteinizing hormone on top of that, and it's a second layer of evidence that factually the hydration argument falls flat. And medically, he's explained why it doesn't work either. So you simply can't take 3 tests, ignore the 2 that you don't like, and then hang on to the one that came in outrageously out of whack with the other 2. Nothing further.
The Commission will now enter deliberation. At this point in time, unfortunately, you're not allowed to speak. We will determine what the outcome is based on the deliberation of this Commission. Well, a lot of information presented today. Organizations, and I think this Commission has debated that policy most recently, almost 3 months ago, and where we decided to revise our regs and to look at WADA and becoming a WADA signatory. We obviously know it is cost prohibitive, both for our Commission and for our promoters. And for this reason, to do the job that we do for a health and safety perspective, we employ methods that we find reliable. We have relied on these methods in the past. And so to say, yes, I think anybody would like to employ the WADA standard. However, given the expense and the amount of compliance, certainly doesn't allow for, I think, combat sports throughout the country and throughout the world to have the resources to employ the WADA standards, but where we can, we will. And we will continue to do what we need to do to ensure the health and safety of our fighters. And given that there are different standards and different methods employed, if we employed every WADA standard to every fight and to every athlete, there would be no sport, because it is extremely cost prohibitive. And from that policy discussion that we've had 3 months ago, I think it comes into play of where we want to go as a Commission and how we continue wanting to regulate this sport. And with that in mind, I think we do have a positive test today. It's not up to the standard as many would judge throughout professional elite athletes and a WADA standard, but it is a standard we have employed and we have utilized throughout time. And I think we will continue to do so. I think our inspectors do a phenomenal job in adhering to the processes that are established for this Commission. We have a chief inspector who's experienced. He's been experienced. He's been with us for numerous years. He's seen us grow. He's seen us expand. He's provided training. He's provided appropriate leadership to the inspectors, such as Mr. Galvan. So those are my thoughts, and that's my perspective at this point. I'm willing to listen to what others have to say.
I think that there's been a finding of liability that has been demonstrated then by the evidence that has been presented during the course of this hearing. One of the things that I can't help but note that in this particular circumstance, that the testing that is done by Quest is more sophisticated than the testing that is done by Smyrtle. We have the exact opposite circumstance because of the dual testing that is done of the same laboratory sample then by Quest versus that is done by Smyrtle in this same circumstance. We heard the testimony from Dr. Sample as to the dual levels for purposes of quality control in this type of circumstance, whereas that single level is only conducted then by Smyrtle. One of the things that I can't help but note that there was 2 opportunities that was afforded to this athlete to be able to determine or to try to verify or to cast doubt then upon the positive finding that was done by Quest, and both of which that he abandoned or he rejected. The first opportunity was for him to have the B sample that was taken by Quest tested. And the B sample testing that is done, contrary to what Dr. Keller has to say, it is done by the same laboratory. It is not sent out to a second laboratory. It is not sent out to some type of a laboratory that did the original A testing on its own sample. They had the opportunity to request that Quest test the B sample, and they didn't do that. Nor did they do the opportunity that was available for them to have tested the B sample that was done by Smirtle. But probably the most important opportunity that this athlete had was to come before us and to provide testimony, to tell us what it is that he was doing, what it is that he was consuming or not consuming, and what efforts that he had taken in an effort to try to ensure that he was in compliance with our regulatory requirements, as well as the requirements that we put upon him the last time that he was here, and he failed to do that. I would note that there may be a legal contest to his assertion of the Fifth Amendment at some point in the future. It is my understanding that based upon the law, that in a civil proceeding that we may infer an adverse or a negative answer to the questions that we posed, since he asserted then the Fifth Amendment in this type of a proceeding. And so to the extent that we may infer then from the questions that we posed to him that everything from the fact that he was consuming marijuana between the time that the fight was announced and when he was attempting then to provide samples, between the time frame then that when he did provide a sample on the 28th, along with his application, to the time that he fought on the 31st, and therefore, based upon those 2 opportunities that he abandoned, that I think lends further support then to the finding that was made by Quest. As to the second allegation that has been made to him, and it's the falsification of the information contained on the pre-fight medical questionnaire. One of the things I can't help but know is that Mr. Diaz is very familiar with that pre-fight medical questionnaire. It's the same questionnaire that he claimed that he didn't understand the last time he was before us in 2010. And in essence, his answer that was found in the amended complaint now says he didn't understand it again. It strikes me as unbelievable and lacking in credibility that an athlete who was grilled on this the first time around, and I believe it was actually the second time around that he was grilled. I don't know, I haven't read the transcript from the first time that he was here, but he doesn't understand the questions that were being asked of him. The second point that I'd like to make concerning what leads to, I think, a finding of liability on the second point, and that is the falsification of the information on the pre-fight medical questionnaire. Marijuana is prohibited in competition. That means that 30 days before, if he had consumed it, it could be ingested and not be prohibited. And therefore, the answer to this question, if he was consuming it, could have been yes and been truthful. But what we have here is a circumstance where an athlete is concerned, what I figure, and from what his lack of response then to the inquiries that we posed indicates then that he was just simply going to say no rather than be truthful in the pre-fight medical questionnaire, for which that we mandate and require then true information. So I think that there's been a finding both of liability on the ingestion of a prohibited substance in competition, as well as a falsification of the pre-fight medical questionnaire. I've got some ideas regarding proposed penalty, but I think that a liability has been found at this point in time.
I have heard all the testimony, and I I think it comes down to, it's not if he's doing it, it's how much he's doing. And that's really the bottom line. And as an athlete who's been here a couple times before on the same issue, I would hope and expect that the athlete would take every precaution to make sure that it was zero, so it wouldn't be finding themselves in this position, especially since they've been here once or twice before on the same exact issue. So to me, it's not if, I guess it's how much. And in my limited time here on the commission, the Quest diagnostic test has been pretty much the commission standard from day one, unless we're in an enhanced and testing environment. So therefore, I'm, as usual, I see it pretty black and white. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, certainly I would address my comments to Mr. Diaz. You, of course, have been in front of me in 2007 and 2012, and I have always shown you the respect you deserve as a champion and as an important contestant in the state of Nevada. And I think your lawyers have done a superb job in making their points in a persuasive manner with respect to standards and how we go about our drug testing. I must agree with my chairman on the fact that over many years, and I have been here perhaps too long, but over many years we have utilized Quest, and there is no doubt that we have relied on their professionalism. But I wanted to say to Mr. Diaz that I was very hopeful of listening to you today personally. And I don't want to take away any of your rights, of course, of use of the Fifth Amendment. I found it a bit peculiar for me only because I wanted to be able to ask you questions with respect to your statements on the pre-fight medical questionnaire. That would be very important to me in that marijuana, you could have answered, as Commissioner Lundvall stated, a yes, and we could have had a discussion about that subject. And I think that's very important for me as simply an administrator in behalf of a commission appointed by a governor in a state of Nevada to regulate the sport of boxing. We need to have that interaction. It is not, of course, a court of law, and we perhaps don't follow all the standards that would be appropriate in a court of law. But I must state that I agree with my fellow commissioners, and unfortunately I feel as though I didn't have an opportunity to get some more information that could have been forthcoming. So why don't we proceed, Mr. Chairman, with her suggestion.
Commissioner Avancino makes a good point. This is not the first time we've dealt with this individual or this issue. This is actually the third time. And I know we've looked at establishing regulations going forward as to multiple offenses. And given that consideration, I think there has to be some discussion given the fact that this is not a first-time offense. This is a third-time offense.
Mr. Diaz was suspended by us in 2007 for marijuana use. In 2009, he failed to show up for a drug test in the state of California and had to forfeit that fight. In 2010, he was suspended by the state of Tennessee for acting as an unlicensed cornerman, and in the middle of also as far as a brawl that broke out. In 2010, he was suspended by us then the second time for marijuana use. One of the things that I think that conduct indicates, as well as the conduct here in 2015, is that we have an athlete that may not have full respect in for this commission, its rules, and its regulations. And it's hard for me to consider a grant of a future privilege for him to come back and to fight in the state. One of the things that I would be supportive of is a lifetime ban for this athlete in the state of Nevada. I would also be supportive of the maximum financial penalty that we can impose upon him. Chris, what was the purse? $500,000. that maximum purse, from what I understand that we have taken in the past, is 33%. I would be supportive of that. And since the outcome was a loss, we don't have to change what the outcome was, and to also to require the athlete then to reimburse the state of Nevada the cost and the fees associated with bringing this proceeding.
Is that a motion, Commissioner Linville?
Yes.
Is there a second to that motion? Or is there discussion of the motion?
Could you repeat the motion once again, Commissioner Lumpel, please?
Motion that I am making is that the suspension to be imposed upon the athlete is a lifetime suspension here in the state of Nevada, that he be financially penalized to the amount of 33% of his purse, that he that he reimburse the state of Nevada then the costs and the fees incurred with bringing this suit.
And we would consider the lifetime ban as a result of, could we discuss that?
Sure.
Amongst us a bit? Is that as a result then of the multiple violations in the state of Nevada and our findings of use of the drug of marijuana during that period for those two incidents? And
that is, as far as my thought process associated with making that recommendation, is that we had an athlete that came before us in 2007 and he promised, I'm not going to do this ever again. And then we saw him again in 2012, and that we know that he failed to show for a drug test then in 2009. We're now in 2015, and it doesn't appear that any of these proceedings have had an impact upon the athlete. And it doesn't appear that the athlete has afforded the respect that this commission and the opportunity, that the privilege for him to fight in this state then affords. And because that he has failed to demonstrate any effort by which then, in an attempt to try to comply then with what I understand that he believes are rules that should not be in place, I think that all of us have certain rules that guide our behavior, particularly in our professional conduct, that we may not agree with, but they are the conditions of our license to practice, or are the conditions by which that our profession may afford us. And if we see no effort that has been made by the athlete, that to me is what is supportive of the fact that he may not be that he just does not have the respect then that we could expect in the future, no matter how many conditions we put upon him, no matter how much testing that we may place upon him, is that he's exhibited no respect for this particular rule.
Commissioner Linville, I can't disagree with anything you just said. I'm just going to speak openly. I'm struggling with the lifetime ban based on the marijuana usage. Completely agree with the disregard for this commission, the rules, the skirting of the issues. You know, getting the licenses 2 days before, keeping the inspectors 4 hours after the fight, and all the little games that we see that go on in the back. But I'm not sure that I'm completely comfortable with the lifetime ban for marijuana usage.
Let me, as far as
and maybe you can convince me on that, but if it was in some of the hearings we've had before where it's, you know, clearly an anabolic steroid, it's clearly something that's way outside the bounds, second, third, fourth time, and we have had testimony and been lied to, and all of the above. I would have liked to hear from him as well today, but I'm not sure that him not getting up here was a smart move on his part, because I'm not sure how that would have gone. So that's the piece I'm struggling with. Everything else I concur with, and I don't know if it's life, if it's 5 years. I certainly know it's not a year, 2 years, or 3, but it's out there.
Well, I think
that's just my
Commissioner Lovell makes an excellent point to us to consider, and what Commissioner Marnell is saying is certainly worthy of our further consideration. As Commissioner Lunville knows, I think I was chair both times. There's no doubt that I was hopeful of speaking to you, Mr. Ortiz, today, or Diaz, excuse me, but I unfortunately couldn't do that. I do think you have not shown the respect you should to your commission or your sport. There's something, I guess, that's troubling me just a bit here with the concept of lifetime.
Let me, as far as offer this observation, and that is, I know that there's a lot of, discussion concerning marijuana use and if it's okay, if it's not okay, whether or not it should be legalized, if it should be regulated, etc. One of the things that, at least that I try to look at, is that we have adopted WADA's prohibited list. And it's WADA, and given its genuinely vast resources, that has put marijuana on that prohibited list in competition. WADA made that decision. We didn't make that decision. And WADA established the standards by which then that an athlete would have to test, and they recently raised those standards. And so the first time that Mr. Diaz was before us, he was at a lower standard. And now he's at a higher standard, and he still can't meet that higher standard. And so it's not this commission that is making some type of a qualitative assessment as to the performance-enhancing capabilities of marijuana use. It is WADA. And WADA has made that determination, and that's why that they have it on the prohibited list. And therefore, part of the reason then that I believe that when you have an athlete that has been given the number of opportunities that Mr. Diaz has and continues to flaunt those requirements, that's why it is that I think that he may and should not be entitled to the privilege to fight in this state.
And I don't disagree with Commissioner Lunville. I think that this commission has generally considered these issues carefully and tried to be unanimous in our approach. We certainly have absolute right to not join a motion or join a vote. Is there not an opportunity here to compromise this in a fashion where all of us would be satisfied with
think
our goals, Chairman?
My struggle for me is, yes, if this were solely a case of marijuana, I think it would be on the lower end for me. This is not just a case of marijuana. I think this is a case of a complete lack of disregard for the sport. And it's not just the positive test or the lack of disclosure on the pre-medical questionnaire. It was the licensing process that this commission had to go through in order to get him to fight or allow him to fight on January 31st. That was a complete, absolute disregard for this commission. And we may not have any standing, but I think this is just not an issue of marijuana. But this is an issue of marijuana, lack of being forthright. It's a lack of cooperating to make the sport better. It's a lack of disregard for the rules, which I think hurts the other athletes just as much as it. Look, I don't have any ego on this commission. Maybe some think I do, but I don't. And it's just, we got to do what our job is to do as a regulator. And this is just not solely a case of marijuana. So my instinct is to lean on the harsher side and on the lighter side.
Harsher as to lifetime?
You know, I don't think it's any less than 5 years.
Well, 5 years is a lifetime for him.
And that's, I know we've had that policy discussion,
Yeah.
is if we do, I mean, are we accomplishing the same thing by the number of years versus a.
Commissioner Lunville?
If in fact that we 5 years may be a lifetime for this athlete. And so to the extent that if we consider and construe that to be a lifetime ban, and therefore you want to make a modification, for a 5-year suspension, I can be supportive of that.
That's the longest we have ever considered, and it demonstrates our disdain for this behavior, primarily of, as you've stated, not being forthright with this commission or showing the respect necessary. I would support that motion.
I would too.
Okay.
Let me modify the motion then, is that we would.
Let me just ask a clarifying
sorry.
question. If we do suspend an individual for a 5-year period of time, does that include the right to attend events in the state of Nevada?
According to regulations, when he's under suspension, there are rules. He can attend, but he can't get within a certain amount of footage from the ring, or he can't go at the back of house, he can't, you know. So there'll be definitely restrictions.
In other words, he could not, it's my understanding that he's not supposed to be within certain parameters so that it appears to have an influence then upon what may be going on then in the octagon or within the ring.
That's correct.
Okay.
It'll be 6 rows from the cage.
So from this perspective, if we make a modification to the suspension, make a motion for then a 5-year suspension of this athlete, 33% of the purse, which was $500,000. Is that correct, Mr. Eccles? Yes. And that he be required to reimburse this commission the fees and costs associated with this proceeding.
I'd second that motion.
There's been a motion by Commissioner Lunville and a second by Commissioner Marnell. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you for your testimony today, and thank you for being here. We'll now move, item number 20 will be trailed or continued until the next agenda item. Public comment, is there anybody in the audience that'd like to make public comment at this time? Seeing none, hearing none, I will go to the telephone. Is there anybody on the telephone who would like to make public comment at this time?
No longer in listen-only mode.
If there's anybody on the telephone who'd like to make public comment, please do so at this time. Hearing none? We'll move to Chairman's report.
The conference is now in listen-only mode.
For disrespect.
The conference is no longer in listen-only mode.
I'm sorry, was there somebody who wanted to make public comment?
The conference is
Chairman
now
report, I don't have a report. Matters for future agendas, obviously the items that were continued from today. Is there a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
There's been a motion by Commissioner Lunville, second by Commissioner Avancino for adjournment. All those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please say nay. Motion passed unanimously. Thank you all for your time today. All right, I don't mean to be rude.